There are regions in Pokémon history that feel older than their years, places where the world seems to hold its breath, where the design of every creature carries the quiet weight of something carefully considered. Johto is one of those places, a land built on tradition and mystery, where ancient towers rise above morning fog and new friendships are made with creatures that carry centuries of cultural memory in their shapes and silhouettes. And before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this. And thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. And as we settle into these quiet mysteries of the Johto region, it is worth taking a moment to notice just how much thought was folded into every corner of this generation. Cyndaquil was one of the three starter Pokemon introduced at the very beginning of Johto's story, and its design carried layers of meaning that most players passed by without noticing. The creature was inspired by the echidna, a small, spiny mammal native to Australia and New Guinea, though its fire typing pushed the design in an entirely different direction than simple naturalism. The flames on its back were not decorative, they were functional, serving as an expression of emotional state. When Cyndaquil felt calm or tired, those flames would recede almost entirely, leaving only the smooth surface of its back. When the creature grew excited or entered battle, the fire would surge upward and outward, making it appear larger and more intimidating than its small size would otherwise suggest. This relationship between emotion and fire became one of the defining visual metaphors for Cyndaquil's entire evolutionary line. Quilava refined this idea, placing the flame vents at 2 points on its body, rather than clustered in one area, giving the creature a sleeker, more purposeful silhouette. The flames felt like they had grown with the Pokémon, becoming more controlled and more directed. By the time the line reached Typhlosion, the fire had moved entirely to the back of the neck, erupting in a blazing mane during battle that recalled images of feudal warriors and traditional fire festivals in Japanese culture. The design team at Game Freak appeared to be tracing a specific emotional arc across the three stages, moving from uncontrolled warmth to focused power to sovereign heat. What makes Cyndaquil particularly interesting is the way its Pokédex entries across multiple games describe it as timid and shy, a creature that relies on its fire as a last resort rather than a first weapon. This personality contrasted sharply with the visual drama of its flames, creating a design that felt layered and internally consistent. A small creature with enormous potential, hesitant to use it, was a story that many players found unexpectedly resonant. Totodile approached its design from a completely different angle, drawing on the crocodile as its foundational animal, but exaggerating its proportions into something that felt more playful than dangerous. The creature's wide grin and stubby limbs gave it an almost toy-like quality, and yet its Pokédex entries consistently described it as possessing jaw strength powerful enough to crush solid stone. This tension between adorable appearance and genuine danger was a recurring theme in Johto's starter Pokémon, and it added a layer of complexity that rewarded players who paid close attention to lore rather than simply battling with their team. Feraligatr, Totodile's final evolution, resolved that tension by committing fully to power and presence, though it retained enough of Totodile's proportional humor in its large head and short limbs to feel like a coherent design evolution rather than an abrupt transformation. The name itself was a compressed wordplay combining ferocious and alligator, a practice common in Johto's localization work, where English names were often constructed with great care to layer meaning into as few syllables as possible. Chikorita's design emerged from the leaf motif in a way that felt almost purely botanical, its entire body suggesting a seed or bud that had not yet fully opened. The large leaf growing from its head was its most distinctive feature, and Pokédex entries noted that this leaf could be used to gauge the humidity and temperature of the surrounding environment. This sensory function gave the simple visual element a purpose beyond decoration, grounding what might have seemed like an arbitrary design choice in something that felt ecologically plausible. The evolutionary line moved through Bayleaf, where the leaf on the head was replaced by a ring of small buds around the neck, each one faintly scented with a calming aroma. Players who reached Meganium found themselves with a creature whose design had become almost entirely about presence and calm. The large flower petals framing its neck released a soothing fragrance that Pokedex entries described as capable of calming the most aggressive of opponents, not through force, but through an almost medicinal gentleness. The three starter Pokemon of Johto, taken together, presented an unusually emotional range of archetypes, and the care with which each line was developed suggested a design team deeply invested in telling stories through visual progression. Sentret was among the first new creatures players encountered in Johto, and its design illustrated one of the generation's quieter achievements, the art of creating small, unremarkable Pokemon that still felt fully realized. The striped tail of a Sentret served a specific function, described in its Pokedex entries. The creature would stand upright on its tail for extended periods to scan the horizon for danger, using the tail as a stabilizing third point of contact while its eyes swept the surrounding terrain. If danger appeared, it would emit a loud cry to alert others of its kind. This behavior was rooted in real Tanuki and meerkat observations, and the way it translated into Pokemon form showed how even a simple early root encounter creature could carry genuine natural history inside its design. Furret extended Sentret's design into something more elegant, its long body and quick movements earning it Pokedex descriptions as one of the fastest creatures on land when moving through narrow spaces. The spiral pattern on its tail became more elaborate, and the cream and brown coloring was refined into something that felt warm and inviting without losing the sense of a creature built for survival in the wild. These early root Pokemon were often overlooked by competitive players focused on strength and typings, but their designs carried more thought than their battle utility might have implied. Hoothoot and Noctowl were Johto's nocturnal owl Pokemon, and their designs played carefully with the unique physical characteristics of real owls in ways that grounded them in biology while pushing them towards something more mythological. Hoothoot's habit of standing on one foot at all times was not a design quirk, but a behavior rooted in real bird biology, with many owl species resting one leg close to their body to conserve heat. Noctowl took this further, its Pokedex entries describing a brain structure that operated differently from other Pokemon, allowing it to rotate its head to unusual angles and process visual information with extraordinary precision, even in near total darkness. The red eyes and more elaborate patterning gave Noctowl a sense of ancient mystery that fit naturally within Johto's themes of tradition and hidden knowledge. Ledaba and Ledian brought the ladybug into the Pokemon world in a form that was unusual for its type. Most bug-type Pokemon in the series leaned into the unsettling or the alien aspects of insects, but Ledian's design moved in the opposite direction, creating a creature that was almost childlike in its proportions and color palette. The spots on its back changed number depending on the number of stars visible in the night sky during the season of its hatching, a detail preserved across several Pokedex entries that gave the design an almost folkloric quality. Ladybugs have long been considered lucky in many cultures, and Ledian carried that symbolism quietly within its gentle appearance. Spinarak and Ariados explored spider biology with a design sensibility that acknowledged the creature's unsettling qualities while still fitting within Pokemon's broader aesthetic. The face pattern on Spinarak's abdomen was a design detail borrowed from real orb-weaving spiders, which occasionally display patterns on their bodies that resemble faces, a phenomenon that researchers believe may deter predators. Ariados extended this web-weaving expertise into something more elaborate, with Pokédex entries noting that it could produce multiple types of silk for different purposes, including a sticky silk for traps and a tougher silk for constructing the structures it used to move between high locations. The design communicated a creature that was patient and methodical, qualities that suited its role as a night hunter in Johto's shadowy forests. Chinchu and Lantern brought bioluminescence into the water roots of Johto in a form that drew heavily from real deep-sea anglerfish. The twin antennae on Lantern's body functioned as lures, glowing with a cool blue-white light that could be used to attract prey or signal to others of its kind in the darkness of the deep ocean. What made the design particularly interesting was how the light was described in certain Pokédex entries as powerful enough to illuminate the ocean floor from enormous depths, suggesting a creature that had adapted to a world of near absolute darkness over millions of years. The choice to make Lantern's coloring warm and friendly rather than threatening was a deliberate softening of the deep-sea horror that real anglerfish sometimes inspire. Before you settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share where in the world you're watching from tonight. Togepi appeared in the Johto games as a creature whose lore was richer than its early game status might suggest. The cracked eggshell pattern on its body was not merely decorative. According to multiple Pokédex entries, Togepi absorbed the positive emotions, kindness, and goodwill of those around it, and stored that energy inside its shell, releasing it in small amounts as a kind of radiated happiness. The design was deceptively simple, a round body with stubby limbs and an eggshell pattern, but the emotional concept it embodied was surprisingly complex. A creature that literally fed on human warmth and gave it back in gentle, invisible doses was a design that operated almost entirely on the level of feeling rather than appearance. Togetic transformed this concept into something more explicitly angelic, with wings and a halo-like crest that placed it within a tradition of guardian spirit designs common in Japanese art. The creature was described as appearing only before people with pure hearts, a folkloric condition that added a layer of mythological resonance to what might otherwise have seemed like a simple, flying evolution. The later addition of Togekiss in a subsequent generation completed the line in a way that extended these themes into something noble and stately, but the Johto entries for Togepi and Togetic remained the emotional core of the family's identity. Natu and Xatu were among the most culturally layered designs in Johto's roster, drawing on Mesoamerican art traditions in a way that was immediately visible but also surprisingly subtle in its details. Xatu's design was directly inspired by the totem poles and ceremonial carvings of Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures, as well as the calendar stones of pre-Columbian civilizations, combining angular geometric patterns with a bird form that referenced the sacred status of birds in many of these traditions. Its ability to see both the past and the future simultaneously, a detail preserved across its Pokédex entries, gave the creature a shamanic quality that felt consistent with these cultural references without reducing them to mere decoration. Natu's smaller form was less elaborately marked, but retained the essential quality of stillness that defined the line. The creature was described as rarely moving its body, preferring instead to fix its gaze on a single object for extended periods. Players who encountered Natu in the game's overworld could see this behavior reflected in the sprite, the creature standing motionless in a way that suggested awareness without action. This kind of consistency between lore and visual presentation was one of Johto's quieter strengths, and the Natu line exemplified it particularly well. Mareep and its evolutions brought electricity into pastoral settings in a way that felt almost entirely unlike the urban energy of Pikachu's lineage. The wool on Mareep's body accumulated static charge as it moved, building to levels that could produce visible sparks around its fleece in dry weather. Fluffy evolved this concept by losing most of its wool to reveal the skin beneath, a biological compromise that allowed the accumulated charge to be stored more effectively in the creature's exposed hide rather than dissipated through the wool. Ampharos completed the transformation, becoming entirely smooth and woolous, its tail and crest now serving as the primary outlets for the vast electrical charge it could produce and release. The design evolution across these three stages was unusually logical from a biological standpoint, showing a creature that had adapted its electricity storage mechanism as it grew larger and its energy needs became greater. Ampharos occupied lighthouses in several cultural contexts referenced by its Pokédex entries, its light reportedly powerful enough to serve as a guide for ships far out at sea. This role as a keeper of light placed the creature within a tradition of mythological animals that bridge the human and natural worlds, a theme consistent with Johto's broader interest in the relationship between people and the world around them. Blossom emerged as an alternate evolution for Gloom, and its design made an interesting choice by moving entirely away from the unpleasant aspects of Gloom's character. Gloom was defined by the incredibly foul odor it produced, and by a honey-like drool that it used as bait for prey, a design that leaned into the carnivorous aspects of certain real flowers. Blossom abandoned all of this, presenting instead a creature that danced in sunlight and wore a skirt of bright petals. The design drew directly from Hawaiian hula traditions, and its dance behavior was described in Pokédex entries as being performed to summon the sun during rainy seasons. The contrast with Gloom's darkness made Blossom feel like a deliberate statement about the potential for transformation, a theme that recurred throughout Johto's approach to evolution and growth. Marill's design was simple enough to have circulated widely as a rumored Pokémon before the generation's official release, its round blue body and distinctive tail earning it a level of pre-release notoriety that most creatures never achieve. The oil stored in its round tail was buoyant enough to keep the creature afloat indefinitely, functioning as both a flotation device and an energy reserve for long swims in cold mountain rivers. Azumarill extended this aquatic expertise and added the large ears capable of detecting sounds from beneath the water's surface, a design element that gave the creature a more complex sensory biology than its cheerful appearance might suggest. Sudowoodo presented one of Johto's most charming conceptual inversions, a rock-type Pokémon designed to resemble a tree. The creature mimicked plant life so convincingly that most trainers and wild Pokémon would pass it by without a second glance, and yet its Pokédex entries noted a deep aversion to water that revealed its true mineral nature. The branching structures on its head were not made of wood or leaves, but of a crystalline rock material, and the creature would flee or panic when it rained, unable to maintain its arboreal disguise under wet conditions. This design worked simultaneously as a puzzle in the game's overworld, where Sudowoodo blocked the road and had to be tricked with a watering can, and as a piece of creature lore that rewarded attentive players with a small moment of narrative satisfaction. Politoed arrived as a new evolution for Poliwhirl, splitting off from the existing path that led to Poliwrath to create something more oriented toward leaderships and social behavior. The curl on Politoed's head was described as a sign of dominance within groups of Poliwag and Poliwhirl, with the most elaborately curled individuals commanding the largest followings. Its call was specifically noted as able to gather others of its evolutionary line from great distances, a behavior rooted in real observations of frog species that use vocalizations to coordinate group movements. The design was rounder and more expressive than Poliwrath, emphasizing social intelligence over physical power in a way that gave the Poliwag line an unusual degree of developmental complexity. Hoppip, Skiploom, and Jumpluff traveled through Johto on the wind, their designs built entirely around the concept of aerial dispersal. Hoppip was light enough to be carried aloft by even gentle breezes, and its Pokédex entries noted that groups of them would link together in strong winds to prevent individual members from being swept too far from familiar territory. Skiploom added a flower to its head that opened and closed with changes in temperature, functioning as both a visual indicator of weather and a method for gaining additional lift from warm air rising from the ground. Jumpluff released clouds of cotton spores as it floated, seeding the landscape below with the next generation of Hoppip as it drifted across the region. This three-stage journey from small and uncertain to graceful and purposeful was a quiet story told entirely through design, and the botanical accuracy underlying the cotton dispersal concept gave it a naturalistic foundation that made the more fantastical elements feel earned rather than arbitrary. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Apom was among Johto's more playful designs, its three-fingered tail functioning as a fully articulated limb capable of gripping branches and handling objects with greater dexterity than its actual hands. Pokédex entries described Apom as so reliant on this tail for daily tasks that its hands had grown less developed over generations, the reverse of most evolutionary trends toward greater manual capability. This biological reversal gave the creature a distinctly unusual place in the taxonomy of Johto's wildlife, and the gap between its cheerful appearance and the strangeness of its anatomy rewarded players who read beyond the surface of its design. Suicune and Sunflora built their identities entirely around solar energy in a way that made them among the most purely elemental designs in the generation. Suicune was described as the weakest Pokémon in terms of base statistics, a fact that the game's designers chose to make explicit rather than conceal. Rather than pretending the creature was more formidable than it was, the Pokédex leaned into its vulnerability, describing Suicune as surviving entirely on morning dew and sunlight, avoiding all energy expenditure between those brief moments of feeding. This extreme conservation behavior gave the design a kind of ecological realism that made its weakness feel like a coherent biological strategy rather than a simple design oversight. Yanma's design translated the dragonfly into a Pokémon form with particular attention to the creature's real-world visual capabilities. Real dragonflies possess compound eyes that cover most of their head and can detect motion across nearly 360 degrees without any movement of the head itself. Yanma's design exaggerated this quality into enormous compound eyes that dominated its face, and Pokédex entries noted it could see clearly in every direction simultaneously, making it nearly impossible to approach without detection. The design also incorporated references to prehistoric dragonfly species, which grew to wingspans of over 60 centimeters, giving Yanma a slightly ancient quality that suited the fossil-conscious world of Johto. Wooper and Quagsire occupied the marshes and shallow waterways of Johto, with a design rooted in the axolotl, a real salamander native to Mexico that retains juvenile features throughout its adult life in a phenomenon called neoteny. The feathery gill structures on Wooper's head were taken directly from axolotl anatomy, and the creature's perpetually cheerful expression reflected the real animal's remarkably human-like facial features. Quagsire took this one step further by becoming fully terrestrial in behavior while retaining its aquatic coloring, a combination that suggested a creature navigating the boundary between two worlds with complete ease. The creature's notoriously poor memory was described across multiple Pokédex entries with a kind of amused affection that gave it a personality distinct from the more dramatic creatures that shared its habitat. Espeon and Umbreon arrived as new Eevee evolutions tied specifically to the time of day, and their design contrasts were carefully constructed to feel like genuine opposites rather than simple mirrors. Espeon's connection to psychic power was expressed through a slim, graceful body and a forked tail capable of sensing subtle changes in the air around it, feeling the microscopic shifts in pressure that preceded weather changes and the emotional states of those nearby. The jewel on its forehead concentrated its psychic energy and also served as a sensory organ, and the pale lavender coloring placed it within a visual tradition of psychic type Pokémon that associated that type with light and refinement rather than darkness and mystery. Umbreon's design worked in deliberate contrast, dark and patient rather than pale and active, its golden ring markings described as beginning to glow when the creature was aroused or threatened, releasing a toxin from its skin that served as a defensive deterrent. The rings gave Umbreon the appearance of something discovered in deep water or ancient cave paintings, a creature whose beauty was functional rather than ornamental. The opposition between Espeon and Umbreon captured something about the generation's broader themes, the idea that light and darkness were not moral categories, but complementary aspects of a single continuous world. Murkrow carried a reputation for misfortune in the Johto region that drew from real cultural associations between crows and ill omens in Japanese and European tradition. The wide-brimmed hat shape of its crest referenced witches' headwear, and its black feathers connected it visually to a tradition of dark omens in folklore. Pokédex entries noted that encountering a Murkrow at night was considered deeply unlucky in certain parts of Johto, and that the creature had developed a habit of stealing small, shiny objects and hoarding them in hiding places within its territory. This thieving behavior connected Murkrow to the real crow's well-documented attraction to reflective objects, grounding the supernatural reputation in observable natural behavior. Slowking arose as an alternate evolution for Slowpoke through a specific interaction with the Shelder that had attached to its head rather than its tail, where Slowbro had been bitten on the tail by a Shelder, accelerating its cognitive processes. Slowking had the Shelder clamp down on its head, producing a venom that reacted with Slowpoke's unique biology to elevate its intelligence to extraordinary levels. The royal crown formed by the Shelder on its head and the regal bearing of the resulting design gave Slowking an air of deliberate dignity that stood in interesting contrast to the essential absurdity of the situation, a Pokémon that had become wise because it was bitten in the head. This kind of gentle humor embedded within serious design was one of Johto's quieter pleasures. Misdreavus floated through Johto's nights as one of the generation's most purely ghostly designs, its appearance suggesting a severed head with long braids that trailed beneath it. Pokédex entries described the creature as feeding on fear, approaching sleeping people or travelers alone at night, and screaming to generate the terror it needed to absorb as sustenance. The pearl-like objects in its hair were described as absorbing the negative energy of this frightened response, storing it in a form the creature could draw on later. The design was unusual because it carried no body below the head, a design choice that gave it an unsettling quality without resorting to graphic imagery, suggesting absence rather than horror. Wobbuffet was a Pokémon whose design and battle mechanics were in unusually close alignment. The creature could not attack, only respond to being attacked, doubling or redirecting the energy of blows directed at it. The small shadow body hiding behind it was described in some Pokédex entries as the true Wobbuffet, with the large blue body being a decoy that absorbed punishment while the real creature remained protected. This layering of deception within a design that appeared almost comically simple gave Wobbuffet a conceptual depth that its goofy expression did not immediately suggest. The creature's tendency to strike a proud pose when greeted was described as a form of social behavior, a greeting ritual that communicated peaceful intent. Girafarig represented one of the generation's more unusual anatomical experiments, its design including a second head at the tip of its tail that possessed its own primitive brain and behaved semi-independently. This secondary head was described as acting purely on instinct, biting anything that came near the rear of the creature without conscious direction from the primary brain. Pokédex entries noted that the tailhead even attacked in its sleep, functioning as an autonomous defensive mechanism that required no active vigilance. The design drew from the concept of bilateral symmetry pushed to an extreme and gave the creature a sense of biological strangeness that its cheerful giraffe-inspired appearance somewhat concealed. Pinnacle and Fortress brought bagworm moth biology into the Johto roster in a form that emphasized defensive protection over all other qualities. Real bagworm moths construct portable cases from plant material and carry these cases throughout their larval stage, retreating inside them when threatened. Pinico translated this into a sealed pinecone form that exploded when it felt threatened, and Fortress developed this concept into an armored sphere of steel that could launch volleys of sharp fragments in all directions as a defensive measure. The design concept of a creature so focused on protection that its offensive capability was an accidental byproduct of that defense was a quietly elegant inversion of typical fighting type logic. Dunsparce was among the generation's most deliberately understated designs, a creature that seemed to exist in deliberate contrast to Johto's many mythologically rich and visually elaborate Pokémon. Its design drew from the Tsuchinoko, a legendary snake-like cryptid from Japanese folklore described as wide-bodied and extremely rare, sometimes attributed with the ability to speak, predict the future, and move in unusual ways. Dunsparce's drill tail, stubby wings, and unusual body shape all referenced this folkloric origin, and its extreme rarity in the game's wild encounters reinforced the Tsuchinoko's legendary status. A creature designed around the concept of being hard to find was an unusual creative choice, but it created a specific kind of delight for players who finally encountered one. Gligar connected desert environments and scorpion biology in a design that gave equal weight to flight and sting, its large wings suggesting a creature that ruled the air in the same way real scorpions rule the ground. The distinctive combination of mammal-like ears, insectoid claws, and a scorpion tail on a single flying form gave Gligar a chimeric quality that felt less like an interpretation of a single animal and more like a synthesis of several ecological strategies. Pokédex entries described it gliding silently on warm air currents and latching onto the faces of larger creatures to deliver its sting, a hunting behavior that was unsettling to read about in the context of a creature that had cheerful, cartoonish proportions. Steelix arrived as a new evolution for Onix in a form that replaced stone with steel, and the transition from one material to the other was explained through a process involving extreme pressure deep beneath the earth. Onix already held the record for the largest naturally occurring rock-type Pokémon in the original generation, and Steelix's design leaned further into the concept of geological scale by describing a creature capable of enduring temperatures and pressures that would destroy most materials entirely. The glassy orbs visible in its body were described as diamonds formed by the same pressures that shaped its steel hide, giving the design a geological poetry that rewarded the scientific imagination. Snubbull and Granbull drew from the English Bulldog in a way that deliberately exaggerated the breed's most characteristic features, its wrinkled face and pronounced underbite becoming the primary design elements around which everything else was organized. The pink coloring and floral patterns on Snubbull gave it an incongruously delicate appearance, creating the same tension between adorable exterior and powerful bite that characterized the real Bulldog's personality. Granbull resolved this tension differently, its larger size and more pronounced physical features, giving it a formidable presence while retaining just enough of Snubbull's gentle coloring to suggest the continuity of the design line. Quillfish brought the pufferfish into the water roots of Johto with a design that focused specifically on the inflation defense mechanism that makes real pufferfish so distinctive. The spines covering its body were described as capable of delivering a potent toxin when it inflated to maximum size, and the design made an interesting choice by rendering the creature in a way that suggested it was perpetually irritated, its expression conveying a being that found the world consistently unreasonable. This character quality gave Quillfish a personality that extended beyond its mechanics and made it memorable in a generation crowded with aquatic designs. Skyzor arrived as a new evolution for Scyther, in a form that replaced the grass-green blade limbs of its pre-evolution with the deep red steel claws of one of the generation's most visually striking designs. The transition from Scyther to Scyther involved a trade of speed for power, and the design communicated this exchange through a shift from sleek and aerodynamic to dense and armored. The eye patterns on Scythor's claws were described as capable of intimidating opponents by suggesting additional faces, a mimicry strategy found in several real butterfly and moth species that display false eye spots to deter predators. This biological reference gave an otherwise purely mechanical-looking design a connection to natural history that enriched its conceptual foundation. Shuckle occupied a strange corner of Johto's ecology, its shell design suggesting a snail or hermit crab, while its actual taxonomy placed it with bug-type Pokémon. The creature's metabolism was extraordinary, converting berries stored within its shell into an intensely concentrated juice over time, a process that transformed ordinary food into something with unusual chemical properties. Pokédex entries in some games noted that this juice could foster the growth of a specific type of organism within the shell, giving Shuckle a role in a larger ecological cycle beyond just its own existence. The creature's unusual combination of extremely low offensive statistics and an extraordinary defensive profile made it one of the more mechanically peculiar designs in the generation. Heracross drew from the rhinoceros beetle in a way that honored the real animal's remarkable strength. Rhinoceros beetles are among the strongest animals relative to their body size on Earth, capable of lifting objects many hundreds of times their own weight. Heracross translated this into a Pokémon form with a single large horn used for wrestling opponents and for anchoring itself to trees while feeding on sap. The coloring was a deep blue that set it apart from most real beetles, and the small star-shaped horn gave it an individualized character that elevated it from mere biological reference into genuine creature design. The fighting type matched its wrestling behavior rather than being assigned arbitrarily, and the combination produced one of the generation's most cohesive designs. Sneasel combined weasel and feline qualities in a dark-type design that was described as extraordinarily swift and calculating. The curved claws it used both for combat and for gripping ice gave it a tool-oriented quality unusual for a creature of its size, and Pokédex entries noted it stole eggs from unattended nests using coordinated group strategies that suggested a level of social planning beyond most Pokémon. The dual feathers attached to its head gave Sneasel a rakish appearance that complemented the mischievous personality described in its lore, and the design's combination of elegance and menace produced a Pokémon that felt genuinely dangerous without relying on purely size-based intimidation. Teddiursa and Ursaring brought bear biology into Johto in two forms that shared a design language while communicating very different scales of presence. Teddiursa's crescent mark on its forehead was described as glowing when the creature was gathering honey, and its habit of licking its paws to taste traces of food left the impression of a creature defined by a quiet relationship with sweetness and comfort. Ursaring presented the same bear biology at a scale that demanded respect, its large size and powerful claws making it one of the forest's most formidable creatures. The ring patterns that gave it its name referenced the circles found in cross-sections of old-growth trees, connecting the creature visually to the forest environment it dominated. Slugma and Magcargo brought volcanic biology into Johto in a design sequence that used magma flow as its central metaphor. Slugma was essentially a sentient stream of slowly moving magma, its soft body never cooling due to constant internal heat. Magcargo extended this by developing a shell that formed from the hardened outer crust of the magma, a geological process in miniature that gave the design a naturalistic foundation. Pokédex entries noted that Magcargo's body temperature exceeded 10,000 degrees, a figure far beyond what any physical material could actually sustain. But the exaggeration communicated the essential idea of a creature that carried volcanic power within a surprisingly small form. Swinub and Piloswine occupied the icy mountain paths of Johto in a design that drew from wild boar biology adapted for extreme cold. Swinub's constant truffle hunting behavior, using its nose to locate food beneath ice and snow, connected it to a specific ecological role that gave its design a purpose beyond appearance. Palau swine extended the boar reference with added woolly coverage and larger tusks, the design communicating a creature that had adapted specifically to tundra conditions. The ancient appearance of Piloswine's design, reinforced by Pokédex entries comparing it to prehistoric animals, suggested a creature from a much older Johto, a remnant of an era when the region's climate was radically different. Corsola occupied Johto's tropical coastline as a design rooted in coral reef biology, its body constructed from branching coral formations that could regenerate when damaged. The creature formed communities in warm, shallow waters, and Pokédex entries describe these groups as producing enough collective light to serve as visual landmarks for sailors navigating unfamiliar coastlines. The soft pink coloring and rounded proportions gave Corsola a gentle quality, consistent with its role in a larger ecosystem rather than as a solitary hunter, and the vulnerability of the real coral reef ecosystem gave the design an emotional resonance that some players found unexpectedly moving. Remoraid and Octillery explored a predator and prey relationship, encoded within an evolutionary connection that felt surprising and somewhat counterintuitive. Remoraid was a small fish that attached to larger Pokémon, using them as mobile feeding platforms and protection while providing something of value in return. Octillery's design shifted entirely from fish to octopus, a transformation that had no parallel in normal biology and that the game treated as simply factual, requiring no explanation. The change was so dramatic that it became one of Johto's most discussed design decisions, with players speculating about the conceptual logic behind it. The answer appeared to lie in both creatures' relationship with precision aiming, Remoraid being named for its remarkable accuracy in shooting water jets at targets, and Octillery extending that precision into an 8-armed hunting specialist. Delibird existed at the intersection of Arctic bird biology and seasonal mythology, its design built explicitly around the Santa Claus and gift-giving associations of the holiday season. The sack-shaped tail in which it stored food and gifts gave it a function entirely unlike any other Pokémon, and its signature attack involved reaching into this sack and hurling the contents at opponents, sometimes with damaging effect, and sometimes in a way that restored the opponent's health. This unreliable and generous quality gave Delibird a personality that matched its festive visual design, a creature that could not quite separate combat from celebration. Mantine and Mantike brought the manta ray into Johto's ocean in a form that captured the ray's genuine grace and scale. Mantine's enormous wingspan and the two Remoraid often found attached to its underbelly gave it a design that felt ecological in its complexity, a creature embedded in a larger web of relationships rather than existing in isolation. Pokédex entries described groups of mantines surfacing together in calm water and leaping entirely clear of the surface, a behavior that real manta rays are known for, and that gave the creature an air of joyful enormity. The gentle filtering feeding behavior described in other entries reinforced the sense of a giant that chose peacefulness as its primary mode of existence. Skarmory was one of the generation's most purely martial designs, its steel feathers and sharp wing edges giving it the appearance of a creature that had evolved specifically for aerial combat. Real birds of prey are already impressive enough, but Skarmory's steel body suggested an arms race pushed to a logical extreme, a bird that had become its own weapon. Pokedex entries noted that Skarmory chick feathers were harvested by people living in parts of Johto to make swords and knives, giving the creature a role in human material culture that grounded the more fantastical aspects of its design in something practical and believable. Houndour and Houndoom brought the hellhound mythology of multiple cultures into Pokemon form in a design that used bone-like external structures and a fiery breathing ability to communicate something ancient and dangerous. Houndoom's horns were described in Pokedex entries as made of the same material as its fangs, a uniform darkness throughout that suggested a creature shaped by something older than ordinary evolution. The burns caused by Houndoom's fire were described as never healing normally, a detail that elevated the creature's danger beyond simple fire-type mechanics and gave it a mythological quality consistent with its design inspirations. The communication system these creatures used, a specific pattern of cries and howls coordinated across great distances, suggested a level of social intelligence that added another dimension to the design. Kingdra completed the Horsea and Seadra evolutionary line in a way that introduced dragon typing to an aquatic design for the first time. Seahorses are among the ocean's most unusual creatures, with the males carrying and birthing young, and Kingdra retained enough of the seahorse's distinctive form to communicate continuity with its pre-evolutions while adding the dragon type's associations with power and rarity. Pokedex entries described Kingdra as resting in ocean trenches at such depth that it was almost never encountered, and that when it woke from sleep and rose to the surface, the resulting whirlpools were large enough to capsize ships. This mythological scale, given to a design that retained the seahorse's essential delicacy, created a productive tension between appearance and reality. Phanpy and Donphan brought the elephant into Johto in two forms that made different choices about what aspects of elephant biology to emphasize. Phanpy's round, childlike form and the trunk used to spray water and greet friends communicated the elephant's social warmth and family-oriented behavior, while Donphan's rolled defensive posture and powerful charge emphasized the elephant's capacity for destruction when provoked. The tire-like patterning on Donphan's body gave it a mechanical quality that connected it to Johto's more industrial elements, and the trunk that became a powerful weapon in this evolved form suggested a creature that had learned to turn its most distinctive feature to multiple purposes. Porygon 2 arrived as a further development of the original Porygon, but where the first Porygon had been designed as an artificial Pokémon composed of computer programming, Porygon 2 was described as a next-generation upgrade that remained unfinished. The researchers who created it had intended to produce a being capable of independent thought and genuine adaptive intelligence, but the Porygon 2 that resulted still showed evidence of incomplete programming in its behavior. This narrative of technology that almost achieved something transcendent but stopped short was an unusual concept to embed in a creature design, and it gave Porygon 2 an air of melancholy potential that distinguished it from most other Pokémon. Stantler occupied Johto's forests as a normal-type deer Pokémon whose most distinctive feature was the spherical protrusions on its antlers. These orbs were described in Pokédex entries as capable of generating optical illusions and distorting the perception of anyone who looked at them too closely, causing disorientation and confusion. The design drew from deer mythology in multiple cultures, where stags were often associated with the boundary between ordinary reality and other states of perception, and the visual distortion ability gave this association a specific, mechanically meaningful expression. The gentle appearance of the creature itself contrasted with this unusual perceptual power in a way that gave Stantler a quiet strangeness entirely its own. Smeargle brought the artistic tradition into Johto's creature roster in a design that gave the concept of creativity a physical embodiment. The tail that dispensed ink from a specialized gland at its tip could theoretically deliver any attack in the game, a mechanical reflection of the idea that artistic imagination has no inherent limits. Pokédex entries described Smeargle communities that marked their territory with individual paintings, each creature developing a recognizable style that identified it to others of its kind. This degree of individual expression embedded in a design concept was unusual in Pokémon, where most creatures were described as species-level behaviors rather than individual creative voices. Tyrogue arrived as a baby Pokémon that served as the shared pre-evolution for three separate fighting type lines, and his design communicated a creature still in the process of determining its own identity. The blank expression and unspecialized body of Tyrogue suggested potential not yet directed, and its evolution path was determined by which of its core statistics developed most strongly. This mechanic encoded the story of a young fighter discovering their natural inclinations into the game's systems in a way that felt genuinely meaningful rather than merely functional. Hitmontop added a third evolution to the Hitmon line in a form built around capoeira, the Brazilian martial art that blends dance, acrobatics, and combat into a single practice. The spinning top movement that gave Hitmontop its name was a direct reference to capoeira's circular, gyroscopic movement patterns, and the creature's perfectly balanced stance communicated a fighting style based on gravity and momentum rather than brute strength. The addition of Hitmontop gave the entire Hitmon family a more complete thematic picture of human martial arts traditions, with Hitmonlee representing kicks, Hitmonchan representing punches, and Hitmontop representing the fluid dance fight hybrid that capoeira embodied. Smoochum and Jinx completed a line whose original design had been the subject of significant discussion regarding cultural sensitivity. The decision to alter Jinx's coloring in later releases demonstrated Game Freak's willingness to revisit designs when their cultural implications were brought to broader attention, and Smoochum's addition provided a pre-evolution that somewhat softened the overall impression of the line by introducing the creature in a younger, less ambiguous form. Elekid and Magby joined the game as baby pre-evolutions for Electabuzz and Magmar respectively, their designs communicating the same elemental forces as their evolutions in forms scaled for inexperience and early development. Elekid's rotating arm structure that generated electrical charge through movement was a design detail that connected the creature's body shape directly to its power source in a way that felt mechanically grounded. Magby's design captured the quality of something newly kindled, the small flame already present but not yet at full intensity, a visual metaphor for potential not yet fully realized. Miltank occupied Johto's farming country in a design that foregrounded the dairy cow's cultural role as a provider of nutrition. The ability to produce milk that could restore the health of other Pokémon gave Miltank a healing utility unusually prominent in a normal-type creature, and the Pokédex entries describing its milk as particularly nutritious for those who were tired or ill gave it a gentle, caretaking character that matched its pastoral appearance. Whitney's Miltank in the Goldenrod City Gym became one of the most notorious early-game challenges in any Pokémon game. Its rollout attack and milk drink recovery making it an opponent that tested new players in ways they rarely forgot. Blissey arrived as the evolution of the original Chansey, expanding on that creature's healing themes into something on an even greater scale. The egg it carried was described as filled with such deep happiness that anyone who ate it would find all their sadness and anger dissolved. This design concept of a creature whose essential nature was the production and sharing of joy gave Blissey one of the most distinctive characterizations in the roster, a Pokemon that existed not to fight, but to heal, and whose extraordinary defensive bulk in battle was simply a reflection of a life philosophy based entirely on absorbing whatever the world directed at it without breaking. Raikou, Entei, and Suicune were the three legendary beasts of Johto, creatures reborn from the ashes of the Brass Tower fire, in a narrative that gave them a mythological origin unlike any legendary Pokemon that had come before. The design team made specific choices about what each beast would represent. Raikou drew from the Raikou, a legendary creature from Japanese folklore associated with lightning that was said to take the form of a tiger or wolf and ride the storm. Its yellow and black coloring and the electrical energy crackling across its body communicated this connection directly, and its speed and elusiveness in the game's overworld matched the lightning it embodied. Entei carried the solemnity of the volcano, its massive leonine form and the steady smoke rising from its body suggesting a creature that had become one with geological time rather than the weather's instant violence. Pokédex entries described a roar that could cause volcanoes to erupt, a power at a scale that removed Entei from any ordinary ecological context and placed it in the realm of forces that shaped the world's surface. The dignity of Entei's design, its unhurried power and heavy presence, gave it a characterization distinct from the more frantic energy of Raikou. Suicune moved through Johto as the embodiment of clear running water and the north wind, its design incorporating references to the wind deity representations found in several East Asian cultural traditions. The ribbons that trailed behind it moved as if in a constant breeze, regardless of actual wind conditions, and Pokédex entries described it purifying any polluted water it passed through. This ecological function gave Suicune a role in the world beyond just existing as a legendary creature, and the journey to understand and catch Suicune formed the thematic backbone of Pokémon Crystal, the third version of the Johto games. Larvitar, Pupitar, and Tyranitar completed one of the generation's most impressive design sequences, tracing a developmental arc from a small burrowing larvae to an armored mid-stage to a creature explicitly compared to Godzilla in design intention. Larvitar's early entries described it eating the soil it was born in, consuming its entire mountainous birthplace before it had enough energy to hatch. This extraordinary dietary requirement gave the creature an origin story embedded in geology and scale, and the progression through Pupitar's hardened chrysalis form to Tyranitar's unstoppable adult form told a story of power accumulating over time. Tyranitar's ability to level mountains in battle and its tendency to ignore anything it considered beneath its attention gave it a presence that felt genuinely mythological rather than merely powerful. Lugia and Ho-Oh anchored the generation's legendary structure at two extremes of scale and symbolism, one ruling the depths of the ocean and one commanding the heights of the sky. Lugia's design drew from several sources simultaneously, the silver wing of its name reflected in a coloring that was neither white nor gray, but some luminous quality between them, and its role as guardian of the seas gave it a depth and solemnity that matched the ocean's own character. The design was notably restrained compared to many legendary Pokemon. Its power communicated through simplicity and scale rather than elaborate decoration. Ho-Oh brought fire and rainbow light together in a design that drew from the Feng Huang, the Chinese phoenix associated with virtue and good omen. The seven-colored tail and the rainbow that followed in its wake connected the creature to the Johto Tower that bore its name, and the three legendary beasts' rebirth under Ho-Oh's influence gave the phoenix its narrative context within the region's history. The warmth of Ho-Oh's coloring and the sense that it flew toward places where those with pure hearts waited made it one of the most emotionally resonant legendary designs in the series' history. Celebi arrived at the end of Johto's mythological structure as a time-traveling guardian of the forest. Its connections to a specific shrine in Johto, rooted in a tradition of forest spirits found throughout Japanese and broader East Asian spiritual practices. The pale green coloring and transparent wings gave Celebi an otherworldly quality that distinguished it from creatures that belonged fully to the physical world, and its ability to appear across time meant that its presence was always slightly displaced from the present moment. The melancholy of a creature that existed everywhere in time, and therefore perhaps nowhere in particular, gave Celebi an emotional depth that its small, gentle appearance reinforced rather than diminished. The Pokémon of Johto, taken together, formed one of the most cohesive regional rosters in the series' history, a collection of creatures unified not by a single design principle, but by a shared sensibility, a willingness to find meaning in the relationship between past and present, between the natural world and the human communities that inhabited it. The bell towers and the ancient roots, the radio broadcasts and the seasons, all of these were reflected in creatures designed with extraordinary care and attention to the stories they could tell without words. What the Johto generation achieved was not simply the addition of more Pokémon to a growing roster, but the deepening of a creative vocabulary. Designs became more emotionally layered, more culturally considered, more willing to tell quiet stories in the space between obvious interpretations. The generation understood that a Pokémon did not need to be dramatic to be memorable, that a creature of genuine depth could be built from something as simple as a bear cub that loved honey, or a floating ghost that fed on screams, or a tiny bird standing motionless on one foot in the dark. These designs carried their meanings lightly, trusting the player to notice the details that mattered, to read the Pokédex entries and find the connections, to understand why a creature that turned into steel was also made of compressed sorrow, or why a fire horse was lonely in the rain. The emotional intelligence embedded in Johto's design work was not announced, but offered, available to those who moved slowly enough through the world to receive it. As these quiet stories settle into the spaces between moments, it becomes easier to understand what made this generation feel like more than simply a set of features added to an already successful game. It felt like a deepening, a turning inward, an invitation to pay attention to the smaller things. And in paying attention to those smaller things, to the way a flame grows with emotion, or the way a bear cub stores sweetness in its crescent mark, players found themselves caring about a world that had been imagined with extraordinary love and given to them to explore. The mystery of Johto was never about secrets hidden beneath the surface. It was about the ordinary surface itself, the way the world of these creatures, taken slowly and with attention, was full of more than it first appeared. Every small encounter, every brief Pokédex entry, every design choice made in a room, somewhere that most players would never see, added one more quiet layer to a world that rewarded the gentle art of noticing. And in that noticing, players found something that stayed with them long after the cartridge was set down. A sense of a place that had been truly imagined, populated by creatures that belonged to it fully, each one carrying its piece of the larger story in a form small enough to hold in a pocket, substantial enough to stay in the memory for a lifetime. The roots between Johto's cities carried their own quiet histories, landscapes shaped over generations of human and Pokémon coexistence into something that felt organic rather than designed. Route 29, the first road that players walked after leaving New Barktown, was a gentle introduction, its tall grass populated with Rattata and Pidgey and the occasional Hoopip drifting overhead. But even this most ordinary of starting roads carried the essential quality of Johto's design philosophy, a world that did not rush to reveal itself, that offered its wonder in small increments and rewarded patience with unexpected depth. New Barktown itself was described as a place where the winds blow in from all corners, a naming choice that connected the settlement to ideas of origin and beginning. The town sat at the eastern edge of the region, and the wind metaphor suggested that everything the story was about to become was already present in potential, carried in the air before any journey had begun. These small poetic gestures, embedded in place names and town descriptions, were part of what gave Johto its distinctive atmosphere, a region that seemed to know it was a story and chose to tell it with care. The journey between cities in Johto involved crossings of terrain that felt genuinely varied, from the foggy paths near Ekritik to the icy routes above Mahogany Town to the surfing routes that connected the coastal cities in a network of blue. Each environment was populated with Pokémon appropriate to its conditions, and the ecological consistency of these placements gave the region a sense of biological plausibility that enhanced the experience of traveling through it. Encountering a Swinub on a mountain path felt correct in a way that contributed to the sense of Johto as a real place rather than a game environment. Violet City held the first gym and also the Sprout Tower, a location whose swaying architecture was modeled after traditional Japanese pagodas and whose internal structure traced the evolutionary history of Bellsprout through its teaching monks and their repetitive battle patterns. The tower was more than a training location. It was a meditation on a single creature, an opportunity to understand Bellsprout's biology and behavior through extended encounter rather than brief summary. This approach of using game locations to teach ecological depth through immersion was one of Johto's quietest educational achievements. Azalea Town's connection to Slowpoke was one of the most developed human-Pokemon cultural relationships in the early games. The town had historically relied on Slowpoke as a source of cultural significance and practical support, and the arrival of Team Rocket to harvest Slowpoke tails for profit established the conflict between traditional relationships with wild Pokemon and the extractive economy, in terms that young players could understand without requiring explicit statement. The restoration of the town's relationship with its Slowpoke population after Team Rocket's defeat felt genuinely meaningful because the game had invested enough time in establishing what that relationship meant. Goldenrod City represented Johto's urban center, its radio tower and department store and game corner filling the space of a metropolitan area within the region's otherwise pastoral character. The radio tower's broadcasts ranged across topics from Pokemon educational content to music to the mysterious transmissions that would later become relevant in the story, and the device served as a genuine piece of world infrastructure rather than simply a landmark. The idea that the region had a media ecosystem, that there were radio personalities and programming schedules and people tuning in from all over, gave Goldenrod a sense of cultural weight appropriate to its size. The national park near Goldenrod introduced a space dedicated to the observation and celebration of bug-type Pokemon in particular, a design choice that communicated something about Johto's relationship with even its smallest and most overlooked creatures. The bug-catching contest that ran on specific days of the week provided an ongoing activity that rewarded players who returned to the park regularly, and the selection of Pokemon available in the park was curated to give players meaningful interactions with a range of insect designs. The park communicated a culture that valued attention to nature in all its forms, not just its most dramatic expressions. Ekruteak City was the spiritual and historical heart of Johto, its two towers embodying the region's deepest mythology, and its gym focusing on ghosts and the traditions of dance that connected the present to the ancestral past. The architecture of Ekruteak felt older than the rest of the region, its buildings referencing historical Japanese urban design in ways that placed it outside the contemporary aesthetic of most other Johto settlements. Morty the gym leader's expertise in ghost-type Pokemon connected him to a tradition of knowledge about the unseen world, and his gym's fog-obscured maze required players to navigate by feel as much as by sight, a physical experience of the uncertainty that defined ghost-type lore. The burned tower that stood opposite the bell tower in Ekruteak was the site of the legendary fire that had killed the three Pokémon who would become Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. The tower's charred interior and collapsed floors communicated the scale of the disaster without requiring explicit description, and the three Pokémon encountered briefly within its depths before fleeing across the region preserved the mythological character of the encounter. Players who understood the connection between the towers and the legendary beasts found that the geography of Ekritake was itself a piece of storytelling, the city's layout containing the region's founding trauma in architectural form. Olivine City and its lighthouse brought a different kind of legendary encounter into the story, one involving the sick Ampharos called Amphi, whose light maintained the lighthouse for the sailors of the surrounding sea. The journey required to obtain the medicine necessary to restore Amphi's health took players across water routes and through a new city, and the emotional investment in a single, named creature who was not legendary or rare, but simply important to the people who depended on its light, was an unusual narrative choice. Amphi was not powerful, it was beloved, and the distinction mattered. Cianwood City, across the water from Olivine, offered a gym focused on fighting-type Pokémon, and a pharmacy that provided the medicine Amphi needed, and the juxtaposition of the hardness of fighting-type training and the tenderness of the errand being run created a tonal complexity unusual in gym town design. The city also featured an in-game photographer who would occasionally capture the player's image with their Pokémon, a small gesture toward permanence and memory that fit within Johto's broader interest in the relationship between the present moment and what would be remembered of it. Mahogany Town's hidden rocket hideout beneath the souvenir shop was one of the generation's most effective uses of location to create narrative surprise. The town presented itself as small and quiet, and the revelation of its concealed infrastructure gave players a sense that Johto's ordinary surfaces contained depths that were not immediately visible. The radio tower broadcasts from the hidden base within the hideout. The use of media infrastructure for criminal communication reinforced the theme of the region's visible culture, existing in tension with forces that operated in the shadows. The ice path leading to Blackthorn City was one of Johto's most challenging navigational environments, its sliding ice puzzles requiring a different kind of attention than the straightforward routes that had come before. The transition from the ice's difficulty to the volcanic cave near Blackthorn was an environmental shift that communicated something about the range of the world's extremes, a reminder that the same region contained both the absolute cold of mountain ice and the absolute heat of underground magma. The Dragon's Den beneath Blackthorn City held both the Elder of the Dragon Trainers and the opportunity to examine the region's most mythologically significant type in its most concentrated form. The Safari Zone in the later additions to the Johto experience extended the region's ecological range in ways that felt consistent with its established character. The ability to encounter Pokémon not available elsewhere in the region created a sense of biodiversity that went beyond what any single route could offer, and the design philosophy of creating spaces specifically dedicated to the observation and preservation of Pokémon reflected the same cultural values that had given Johto the national park. Mount Mortar connected the eastern and western portions of Johto through a cave system large enough to contain an entire hidden life, complete with waterfalls and hidden paths, and an encounter with Kyo, a martial artist who had been training in its depths for reasons he declined to fully explain. The mountain's interior felt genuinely vast, and the Tyrogue that Kyo would eventually entrust to the player gave the detour through the mountain's darkness a purpose that felt earned rather than arbitrary. Tin Tower's ascent toward the Bell Tower's summit was one of the most emotionally charged moments in the game, the long vertical climb through layers of guarding monks and increasingly sparse surroundings creating a sense of genuine elevation in both physical and metaphorical terms. Ho-Oh's presence at the summit was the culmination of a mythological thread that had been running beneath the game's surface since the earliest moments in Ekritake, and the encounter felt like an arrival at something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to become visible. The Whirl Islands held Lugia in their submerged caves, accessible only by passing through multiple layers of cave and water in a journey that felt appropriately oceanic in its duration and its character. The islands themselves were unremarkable from the surface, and that deliberate understatement made the discovery of their hidden depth feel like the region's geography was doing its own version of the storytelling that the Pokemon designs had been doing throughout. The ordinary surface concealing the extraordinary interior was Johto's fundamental narrative gesture, repeated at every scale. The design of Johto's gym leaders was itself a form of storytelling about the culture of the region. Faulkner in Violet City combined a traditional fighting aesthetic with a genuine love for flying-type Pokemon that came through in his dialogue rather than just his team composition. Bugsy in Azalea Town was described as a researcher whose knowledge of bug-type biology was genuinely academic rather than merely competitive, and this character detail gave his gym a different quality from most. Whitney's notorious Miltank notwithstanding, her gym communicated something about normal-type Pokemon's underappreciated depth. Morty's fog-obscured gym and ghost specialization placed him in a specific cultural tradition. Chuck's waterfall training communicated physical dedication. Jasmine's concern for Amphi gave her a compassionate dimension that made her fight feel less like an obstacle and more like an encounter with someone who had other things on their mind. Price's ice specialization was accompanied by a backstory about a lost Pokemon that gave his character genuine emotional depth, unusual for a gym leader. Claire's dragon mastery and her reluctant acknowledgement of the player's victory after defeat was one of the generation's most memorable characterizations. A person who had defined themselves entirely around a single type and found it genuinely difficult to extend respect to someone who had defeated that identity. The Elite Four and champion structure in Johto built toward Lance in a way that felt appropriate given his presence earlier in the story as an ally and fellow investigator. Will's psychic mastery, Koga's poison expertise elevated from his earlier role as a gym leader, Bruno's physical power, and Karen's dark-type team all contributed to a progressive intensification that made Lance's arrival feel culminatory rather than abrupt. Lance's red cape and his dragon specialization had been established before his role as champion was revealed, and the continuity of character made the final encounter feel like a genuine reunion rather than merely a battle. The post-game journey to Kanto added an extraordinary dimension to the Johto experience, the ability to travel back through the locations of the previous generation and find them changed by the passage of time. The gym leaders encountered in Kanto had moved on in various ways, the famous Bill now living in Goldenrod City, the Pokemon seen in familiar locations replaced by species native to Johto who had crossed the regional boundary. Kanto's familiar landscape, viewed through Johto's sensibility, created a layered experience of time and change that no other Pokemon game had attempted on the same scale. The differences between the original Gold and Silver versions and their remakes, released years later, illustrated how the same story could be told with different tools while preserving its essential character. Heart Gold and Soul Silver introduced the feature of walking Pokemon, allowing the lead creature in a player's party to follow them through the world as a visible companion. This feature gave the Pokemon trainer relationship of physical expression that the original games could not provide, and players who had grown up with Gold and Silver found themselves encountering their childhood memories through a new emotional register. The small details visible in each following Pokemon's behavior, the way they faced toward items on the ground or lagged behind when tired, added dimensions of personality to creatures that had previously existed only in menus and battle screens. The Pokegear that players carried in Johto served as both a narrative device and a piece of world-building infrastructure. the radio function, the phone function that maintained contact with defeated trainers, the map that tracked the player's position. All of these combined into an object that communicated a region connected by technology and social relationship. The calls from trainers who wanted rematches or who simply checked in to share minor observations about the world gave Johto a social texture that made it feel populated in a way that the silent roots might not have on their own. Professor Elm's research into the conditions that triggered Pokemon evolution gave the generation a scientific framing for questions that had been present in the series from the beginning. Why did Pikachu become Raichu? What drove the developmental process that transformed a small creature into a larger, more powerful one? Elm's fascination with these questions as academic puzzles, rather than merely game mechanics, connected the world's science to the sense of genuine inquiry that ran through the generation's approach to creature design. The holding of evolutionary stones as objects with specific physical properties that interacted with particular biological systems suggested a world where the mechanisms of the extraordinary had rational structures waiting to be understood. The concept of friendship as a trigger for certain evolutionary paths was introduced in Johto in a form that made the player's relationship with their Pokemon structurally meaningful in new ways. Eevee would not evolve into Espeon or Umbreon through stone or level, but through the bond formed during walking together under specific conditions. This mechanic communicated something important about the generation's values, that some transformations could not be forced or purchased, but had to be grown through time and attention. The same mechanic governed the evolutions of Togepi and Pichu and others, creating a category of development that operated on emotional logic rather than purely biological progression. The day and night cycle that had been introduced in Gold and Silver changed the experience of traveling through Johto in ways that shaped the emotional quality of different parts of the journey. Routes encountered at night had a different population of wild Pokemon than those encountered during the day, and the visual shift from the warm colors of afternoon to the cooler tones of evening to the deep blues of late night created an atmospheric progression that made the passage of time feel real rather than merely functional. Players who stayed up playing past their usual bedtime found themselves in a Johto that matched their own experience of the late hour, a region that responded to the time in the same way the world outside their window did. The seasons were referenced in Johto's design even before the mechanic was fully implemented in later games, with certain events and encounters tied to specific times of the year and certain locations described in Pokédex entries as showing different characteristics in winter or summer. This seasonal awareness in the world building suggested a region that was understood as existing in real time rather than a perpetual present, a place that had a past and would have a future and was currently experiencing a particular moment in its ongoing life. The evolution of the game's narrative understanding across the Johto generation and its sequels revealed a design team thinking carefully about what a Pokemon game was for beyond its immediate entertainment function. The themes of tradition and modernity, of preservation and change, of the relationship between human communities and the natural world were not subtext in Johto, but text present in the design of each city and route and creature, available to any player who chose to read them. What distinguished Johto from a simple continuation of what had come before was this quality of genuine reflection, a generation that seemed to be thinking about what it meant to be a Pokemon game, rather than simply assuming that more of the same would be sufficient. The introduction of breeding gave players a new way of understanding where Pokemon came from, connecting the game's creatures to the biological processes of the real world in a form that was immediately engaging and conceptually rich. The ability to pass down moves through breeding opened competitive dimensions, but more importantly, it suggested that the creatures of Johto had lives and relationships that preceded the player's encounter with them, that each Pokemon carried within it the biological history of its lineage. The Pokemon eggs introduced in the daycare center communicated this biological depth in a form available to any player, even those with no interest in competitive optimization. Watching an egg hatch into a creature with a known parentage was different from encountering that creature in tall grass. The difference between witnessing an origin and encountering something already in progress. Johto made these origins available in a way that added a layer of particularity to individual Pokemon that the previous generation's design had not fully provided. The concept of shiny Pokemon, introduced in gold and silver as creatures with alternate colorations visible to anyone lucky enough to encounter them, created a new relationship between players and the randomness of the world. A shiny encounter was not engineered by the game, but produced by probability, and the specific memory of the moment of unexpected encounter created stories that players preserved and shared with a specificity unusual in the normally collective experience of Pokemon. Your shiny Pokemon was yours, not just by capture, but by the particularity of the moment it revealed itself. A private accident elevated into a lasting individual possession. The trading and battle systems that connected Johto players to each other across link cables created a social dimension that extended the game's meaning beyond the single-player journey. Trading to evolve a specific Pokemon required trust and coordination between players, and the experience of encountering another player's trained team in battle introduced a dimension of creative expression that the AI opponents in the game could not provide. The community of players that formed around Gold and Silver's trading and battling was one of the generation's most significant features, creating a shared world of practice and exchange that gave the individual journey a social context. Looking back at Johto from a distance of many years, what remains most vivid is not any single dramatic moment, but the accumulated effect of small things handled with unusual care. The way Wooper looked content in water and slightly lost on dry land. The way Slowpoke tails grew back after being cut, suggesting a resilience written into the creature's biology at a level below consciousness. The way Sudowoodo panicked in rain and revealed itself as something other than it appeared. The way Smeargle marked every surface it encountered with evidence of its own unique vision of the world. These were not large details. They did not change the outcome of battles or alter the trajectory of the story, but they accumulated over the course of the journey into something that felt like knowledge, a genuine understanding of a world populated by creatures who had been thought about with genuine depth and affection and made available to be known. Johto gave players that gift without fanfare and without asking anything in return, except the willingness to walk slowly enough to receive what it offered. The bells that rang across the region between the two towers were not just atmospheric detail, but a structural metaphor for the generation's entire approach. Something calling out across a distance, a sound that asked to be heard rather than demanding attention. An invitation extended by the world to those willing to stop and listen in the right place at the right time. Johto rang those bells throughout its design, in the names of its creatures and the behaviors described in their entries, and the quiet connections between the life of the world and the life of the player moving through it. And in that space between the bells, in the gentle silence that followed each ringing out and waited for the next, was where the generation's real character lived, not in the battles won or the legendary creatures caught, but in the sense that the world had been built by people who loved it, for players who were invited to love it in return. That invitation, extended with patience and without insistence, was Johto's most enduring and most quietly remarkable achievement. The legacy of the Johto generation in the broader history of Pokémon design was one of deepening rather than expansion. The additions to the roster were fewer in number than the original generation, but each creature had been considered with a care that showed in the small details. The types given to each Pokémon felt motivated rather than assigned. The designs communicated specific biological and mythological sources without becoming simple illustrations of those sources. The ecological placement of creatures within their environments suggested a world with consistent internal logic. Later generations would build on what Johto established, but the Johto generation's particular achievement was in demonstrating that the Pokemon formula could accommodate genuine emotional and cultural depth alongside its established mechanics of collection and battle. That discovery, made in a set of games played on small screens with limited palettes and constrained storage, remained one of the most significant creative contributions the series ever made to the medium of games as a whole. The relationship between Johto and its predecessor Kanto extended beyond mere geographical adjacency into something that resembled the relationship between two generations of a family, related by continuity but shaped by different values and different moments in history. Where Kanto had been defined by the energy of discovery, a world being explored for the first time and categorized with the enthusiasm of initial encounter, Johto brought to the same space a spirit of reflection, a willingness to ask what the world meant rather than simply mapping its boundaries. This generational difference between the two regions was visible not just in the design of their Pokemon, but in the design of their cities and routes and the stories told about each place. Kanto's cities had been named for colors, a bold and simple organizing principle that communicated the fresh clarity of first encounter. Johto's cities were named for plants and natural materials, an earthy and organic naming philosophy that reflected the region's investment in the living world and its ongoing processes. Palette and Pewter and Cerulean gave way to New Bark and Cherry Grove and Violet, and the shift in naming logic was a shift in sensibility, from the graphic and visual to the botanical and biological, from colors applied to the world to things that grew from within it. The move tutors and special move teachers scattered across the Johto region continued a tradition of gameplay mechanics that rewarded exploration and conversation. But in Johto, these teachers carried additional significance as bearers of specific knowledge tied to particular places and traditions. The Dragon Den's elder tested the player's values before granting certain gifts, and this gatekeeping of power behind tests of character was a design choice that connected the acquisition of ability to the development of wisdom. In Johto, you could not simply purchase the strongest knowledge. You had to demonstrate worthiness, and the demonstration required genuine engagement with the world's values rather than merely its systems. The design of the Pokemon storage system in Gold and Silver, while mostly a continuation of the previous generation's approach, was handled within a narrative of technological development that gave it a contextual meaning. The upgrades to the storage system that occurred during the game's story connected the practical management of the player's Pokemon collection to the in-world progress of technology, suggesting that the tools players used to interact with the game were themselves artifacts of an ongoing developmental history. This integration of meta-gameplay elements into narrative context was subtle but contributed to the sense that Johto was a world that knew it existed in time. The concept of apricorn balls, the alternative Pokeball types crafted by Kurt in Azalea Town from specific fruits found on trees across the region, was one of Johto's most beloved innovations in both mechanical and thematic terms. Where the standard Pokeballs of the setting were industrial products, standardized and mass-produced, Kurt's balls were individually crafted objects with specific properties determined by the characteristics of the apricorn from which they were made. A heavy ball for heavy Pokemon, a lure ball for fishing, a moon ball for Pokemon that evolved with moonstones. The specialization of these tools for specific applications communicated a tradition of craft knowledge that stood in contrast to the generic utility of commercially produced equivalents. Kurt himself was characterized as a craftsman who had inherited this knowledge from previous generations and who felt a responsibility to maintain it, even as standardized alternatives became more widely available. His choice to continue making apricorn balls by hand, one at a time, from fruits brought to him by individual trainers, was a statement about the value of specific knowledge and careful attention in a world increasingly organized around convenience and scale. Players who brought Kurt their apricorns and waited for the next day to collect the finished balls were participating in a form of exchange that operated on the logic of craft rather than commerce. The berry system that was developed across the Johto games and expanded in subsequent generations had its foundations in the Johto experience of finding growing berries on trees scattered through the region and using them for specific purposes, ranging from healing to flavoring contests. The attention to plant biology embedded in the berry system, different berries with different growth rates and different yields under different conditions of care and climate, suggested a world where the natural systems of plants and their cultivation were subjects worthy of attention and investment. The berries of Johto were not merely consumable items, but representatives of an ongoing ecological process that players could participate in and influence. The contests and the social activities that would be developed more fully in subsequent generations were present in embryonic form in Johto, with elements of Pokémon appreciation that went beyond combat beginning to appear as alternative modes of engaging with the creatures. The beauty of a Pokémon, its characteristics beyond its battle utility, began to emerge as a valued quality in its own right, and this aesthetic dimension of the human-Pokémon relationship would eventually become an entire parallel system in the generation that followed. Johto planted the conceptual seed for this expansion by establishing that the world contained people who related to Pokémon in ways that were not primarily competitive. The music of Johto, composed with the specific atmospheric requirements of different locations and times of day in mind, created a sonic landscape that contributed to the region's distinct character in ways that players often absorbed unconsciously and felt deeply without being able to articulate precisely why. The traditional Japanese instrumental influences in certain area themes, the contrast between the energetic rhythms of Goldenrod City and the slow, contemplative motifs of Ekrutake, the haunting quality of the burned tower's sparse melody, all of these contributed to an experience of place that was as much auditory as visual. The way the music changed as players crossed from one area to another without sharp transition created a sense of the world as a continuous space rather than a collection of separate rooms, and the specific qualities of different locations communicated through their musical character made those locations feel inhabited by specific atmospheres that preceded the player's arrival and would continue after departure. Johto was a world that had its own sonic presence, and that presence was one of the generation's most enduring achievements. The way that Pokémon designs communicated personality through visual means alone, without requiring Pokédex entries or dialogue to establish character, was one of the most refined aspects of Johto's design vocabulary. Wobbuffet's perpetual salute and its tendency to produce a second smaller form from behind its body communicated a specific character that players recognized immediately without being told what to think about it. Quagsire's expression and its slow, unhurried movements communicated a specific relationship with the world that matched the Pokédex description of its poor memory without requiring players to read that description to understand the creature's essential quality. This capacity for pure visual character communication was not universal across all designs, but where it worked, in the better designs of the Johto generation, it created creatures that players felt they knew immediately and continued to know more deeply the longer they spent with them. The familiarity built through repeated encounter and through the small animations that expressed the creature's responses to various in-game events created relationships that were genuinely personal, built from specific moments of interaction rather than simply assigned by category. The way that Pokemon types were distributed across the Johto roster created a specific ecological character for the region. The concentration of water types along the coastal routes and in the Whirl Islands gave those areas a marine identity that was reinforced by the other design elements of those locations. The presence of ghost types, specifically in Ecruteak and its surrounding areas, connected the region's most mythologically significant location to the type most associated with what could not be seen or fully understood. The ice types in the northern mountains communicated altitude and climate in the same way that real mountain ecosystems change character as elevation increases. This ecological type distribution was not always perfectly consistent, and some Pokemon appeared in locations that felt slightly arbitrary, but the overall effect was of a region that had been designed with attention to the relationship between creature and environment. The feeling that you might encounter different creatures depending on where you were and what conditions surrounded you contributed to the sense of exploring a genuine ecology rather than simply sampling a list of available creatures. The mechanics of Pokemon behavior in the overworld, the way wild Pokemon were invisible until encountered in tall grass, the way trainers on routes had fixed fields of vision and would challenge any player who entered them, created a specific quality of movement through the world. Players learned to read routes for trainer positions and to choose paths that avoided unwanted encounters when in a hurry, but also learned to engage with every element of a new area when exploring for the first time. This reading of space, developing a tactical understanding of the physical layout of a route or dungeon, was one of the quieter skills that Pokemon games developed in their players over time. The Pokemon world's trainer economy, the money earned through successful battles that could be spent in shops and game corners and used to purchase items and access services, created a sense of the world as having systems that extended beyond the player's immediate experience. There were industries and markets and services that existed for reasons beyond simple gameplay function, and the occasional glimpse of these systems through the items available for purchase and the places where money could be spent gave the world an economic texture that grounded it in familiar logics. The friendship between the player and their Pokemon was not described in Johto through elaborate narrative, but demonstrated through mechanical and visual means that accumulated over time into something that felt genuine. The Pokemon that followed the player in Heart Gold and Soul Silver could be turned toward and interacted with through simple button press, and the responses generated by different Pokemon in different circumstances, tired after a long journey, or excited by a recent battle, or simply content with the moment, created a record of shared experience that individual players experienced as personal history. The concept of a starter Pokemon chosen at the beginning of the game and carried through the entire journey was not unique to Johto, but Johto's implementation of it, with the three starters' distinct personality profiles and evolutionary trajectories, created a choice that shaped the emotional character of the entire experience. Players who chose Cyndaquil traveled with something shy and warming that grew into sovereign power. Players who chose Totodile carried constant, cheerful energy that resolved into impressive scale. Players who chose Chikorita brought a patient, botanical presence that became something almost stately in its final form. These three emotional trajectories were not just mechanical preferences, but genuine personalities. In the long game of carrying a starter from its first timid steps to its fully evolved presence was a journey with a beginning and middle and end that players felt. The concept of the Pokemon journey itself, the movement from home through a series of challenges toward a distant goal, drew from an ancient narrative structure. The hero's journey made available in a form that was both immediately accessible and surprisingly deep. Johto understood this structure as inherited and built on it, rather than replacing it, adding layers of emotional and ecological complexity to the basic framework while preserving the core of forward motion through a world that was growing more familiar with each encounter. The journey through Johto was an education in the world's character, and the education was structured to reveal its most profound elements only to those who had traveled far enough to receive them. The legendary encounters that punctuated the journey provided moments of genuine awe in a game that might otherwise have maintained a consistently gentle pace. Finding Suicune on the shores of a lake, appearing briefly before fleeing, or encountering Raikou in the grass of a root, creating a moment of electric surprise before it disappeared, gave the world a sense of inhabited mystery that made ordinary travel feel potentially significant. Any route could contain an encounter with something that exceeded the ordinary, and this possibility gave players a quality of attention to the world that rewarded alertness without demanding constant vigilance. The seasonal events tied to specific real-world dates gave the Johto experience a connection to the actual passage of time that extended the game's meaning beyond its immediate play session. The bug-catching contest, on specific days, the different Pokémon available at certain times of year, the small calendar of the in-game world aligned to the calendar of the world outside it, created a design that treated the game not as a fixed experience to be completed, but as an ongoing presence in the player's life that would continue to offer new things to those who returned to it. The ending of the Johto story, when it came, felt less like a conclusion than like a clearing. The challenges were complete, the legendary creatures were known, the champion was defeated, but the world remained, and the player's relationship with their Pokémon continued, and the sense that there were still small things to discover in corners not yet visited gave the completion of the main journey a feeling of beginning as much as ending. Johto understood that the most important journeys don't end so much as they open out into larger spaces, and its design accommodated that understanding with the same quiet care it had brought to every other element of the experience. The mystery that the title of this exploration promised was always this: not the mystery of hidden information or concealed secrets, but the deeper mystery of a world that had been made with so much love and care that every corner of it rewarded attention. The Johto region carried that mystery in every Pokémon that moved through its routes, and every city that housed its people, and every tower that stood as evidence of what had happened there and what those events had meant. To explore Johto slowly, with the willingness to stop and read and notice, was to participate in an act of genuine cultural and natural history, a history imagined with extraordinary vividness and offered freely to anyone willing to receive it. And receiving it, night after night in the glow of a small screen or years later in the warmth of memory, was its own particular kind of gift. The quiet persistence of Johto's influence across subsequent generations of Pokémon design was visible in the way later games continued to reference its creatures and its mythological structures. Ho-Oh's appearance at the very beginning of the original anime series, glimpsed by Ash before it had been officially revealed to most players, established the bird as a symbol of something beyond ordinary encounter, a promise of further wonders ahead. The image lodged in the collective memory of a generation of players and viewers in a way that endured long past the game's initial release, becoming one of the most recognizable single images in the series' visual history. The later return to the Johto region in Heart Gold and Soul Silver demonstrated something important about the durability of good design. When those remakes appeared with significantly enhanced technical capabilities, the essential character of the region came through with complete clarity. The places and creatures and music of Johto had been designed in a way that transcended the specific hardware constraints of their original implementation, carrying their essential qualities into any medium capable of expressing them. This durability was not accidental, but the result of design work that had focused on what was most fundamentally true about each element, rather than on what could be most technically impressive. The enduring conversation among players about which generation was their favorite almost always included significant representation from those who named Johto, and the reasons they gave consistently referenced the qualities this exploration has traced: the depth of the creature designs, the richness of the region's mythology, the emotional resonance of the journey. These players were not simply remembering their childhood fondly, they were recognizing something that had been genuinely achieved and that continued to demonstrate its quality at whatever age they returned to it. The invitation that Johto extends to look carefully and find more than was immediately apparent remains open to anyone willing to accept it. That invitation is always waiting in the fog above Ekritake, and in the deep water below the Whirl Islands, and in the tall grass along every ordinary route, patient and generous, and entirely undemanding of anything except the willingness to be present. The wild Pokémon of Johto were not simply obstacles encountered in tall grass or cave systems. They were inhabitants of a world with its own internal logic, and the more closely a player studied the conditions that placed each creature in its particular location, the more that logic revealed itself as genuinely coherent. The ghastly line haunted the Sprout Tower and the Burned Tower, rather than appearing on random routes, because those locations carried the accumulated weight of history and tragedy necessary to support the presence of ghost-type Pokémon. Ghastly itself, a creature described as composed almost entirely of gaseous matter with only a tiny core of solid substance, required environments already saturated with spiritual significance. The towers provided that saturation, and the ghost-type concentration within them felt ecologically appropriate rather than arbitrarily assigned. Haunter extended the ghastly line's design in a direction that made the ghostly quality more personal and more intimate. Where ghastly was atmospheric and diffuse, Haunter had features, hands, and a face that communicated something specific about its relationship with those it encountered. The disembodied hands that accompanied Haunter were described in Pokédex entries as capable of causing numbness through touch, a paralytic effect that translated the metaphorical cold of ghostly presence into a physical sensation with mechanical meaning. The grin that defined Haunter's facial design was not the simple cheerfulness of a friendly creature, but something more knowing. A smile that suggested an awareness of things unseen by those it faced. Gengar completed the line's transformation by becoming solid, a ghost that had accumulated enough presence to take a fully physical form that nonetheless retained all of the type's associations with the unseen. The shadow dog aesthetic of Gengar's design drew from Japanese folklore traditions, where shadow creatures were understood as reflections of the darker aspects of human nature given autonomous existence. Pokédex entries describing Gengar as lurking in shadows and lowering the temperature of any room it entered gave the creature a specific ecological signature that players could theoretically use to identify its presence before seeing it, a design detail that rewarded imaginative engagement with the lore. The introduction of the Pokémon Gold and Silver games to Western markets brought with it a specific challenge of cultural translation that the design team navigated with careful attention. Many of Johto's most distinctive designs drew from Japanese cultural contexts that international players might not share, and the decisions about how much to explain versus how much to trust players to research and discover were made on a case-by-case basis throughout the game's localization. The result was a generation that offered different depths of meaning depending on what players brought to it, accessible at a surface level to anyone but revealing additional layers to those who investigated its sources. Unown presented one of the generation's most conceptually unusual designs. A set of 26 Pokémon each, shaped like a letter of the Latin alphabet, with 2 additional forms resembling punctuation marks. The design raised questions that the game deliberately left unanswered. What was the relationship between these creatures and the ancient ruins where they were found? Were they a language, or did they only resemble one? Did they communicate, or merely exist in shapes that suggested communication without fulfilling it? The ruins of Alf, where Unown were concentrated, carried puzzle chambers that, once solved, released shards of these creatures into the inner walls, and the sense that the player was uncovering a script without being given the means to read it created a productive intellectual frustration that generated speculation and community engagement for years after the game's release. The radio signals that could be received in the ruins of Alf from radio tower broadcasts became strange and distorted in proximity to the Unknown concentrations, a detail that connected modern technology to ancient mystery in a way that suggested the two systems were in some kind of interference relationship. Whether this was intended as evidence of genuine supernatural influence or simply as atmospheric world building was never clarified, and that deliberate ambiguity was consistent with Johto's broader approach to the relationship between the explainable and the inexplicable. Porygon 2's presence in Johto raised questions about the relationship between artificial intelligence and natural creatures that the games did not attempt to fully resolve. The original Porygon had been the first fully artificial Pokémon, a digital creature created by human programmers and capable of entering computer systems. Porygon 2 was the next iteration of this project, described as demonstrating behavior and responses that exceeded what its original programming should have permitted. The gap between what Porygon 2 was designed to do and what it actually did so was described in Pokédex entries with a quality of scientific puzzlement that matched the genuine uncertainty of researchers studying emergent behavior in complex systems. This design thread suggested that the Pokemon world's understanding of the boundary between programmed behavior and genuine intelligence was not settled, that the question of what it meant for Porygon 2 to think and respond remained genuinely open. The later addition of Porygon Z in subsequent generations would extend this narrative of artificial intelligence development, with a creature that had been modified further and whose behavior had become genuinely unstable, tracing an arc across 3 generations that resembled some of the more sober speculative fiction about artificial intelligence development. The daycare center on Route 34 and its system of Pokemon breeding introduced a dimension of the creature's biology that the games had previously left entirely implicit. The fact that 2 compatible Pokemon left together at the daycare would eventually produce an egg was presented as simply factual, a mechanism available to players who wish to use it, but the implications for the broader understanding of how Pokemon reproduced and developed were significant. The eggs could contain creatures with inherited movesets from their parents, a transmission of learned behavior across generations that suggested a form of cultural inheritance alongside the biological one. The existence of baby Pokemon, accessible only through breeding, gave certain evolutionary lines an additional depth that observation of wild adults could not provide. Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, Togepi, Tyrogue, Smoochum, Elekid, and Magby all represented the earliest stage of life for their respective lines, creatures that existed before the transformations of evolution had reshaped their essential nature. Encountering a Pichu that would eventually become Pikachu and ultimately Raichu was a different experience from simply finding a Pikachu in tall grass, because the baby form communicated something about what the fully evolved creature had once been and could not otherwise be understood to have passed through. The specific mechanics of how held items interacted with evolutionary paths was introduced in Johto in ways that added a material dimension to the concept of transformation. Metal Coat and Upgrade, the items that triggered the evolution of Scyther into Scyther and Porygon into Porygon 2, suggested that evolutionary potential could be unlocked by interaction with specific materials rather than simply by the passage of time or accumulation of experience. This mechanic grounded certain evolutionary transitions in the logic of the physical world, connecting transformation to the qualities of matter in a way that felt like it belonged to the same intellectual tradition as alchemy. The King's Rock, which could trigger the evolution of Slowbro's alternative path into Slowking, or Poliwhirl's alternative path into Politoed, was a design detail that placed cultural symbolism within the evolutionary system. A rock shaped like a crown that could transform creatures into their more regal forms was a literalization of the idea that certain objects carried the transformative power, a concept common to folklore across many cultures. The item's name and shape made its symbolic logic transparent without requiring explanation. The dragon scale that allowed Seadra to evolve into Kingdra was similarly literal, a piece of dragon anatomy serving as the catalyst for a transformation that elevated the evolutionary line into dragon-type status. The suggestion embedded in this mechanic was that becoming a dragon required not just internal development, but some form of external contact with dragonhood itself, a piece of the category needed to fully enter it. This idea, that transformation, sometimes required an external component rather than simply an internal one, gave the item-based evolutions a philosophical dimension that pure level-based progression lacked. The Pokémon contests that were introduced more fully in subsequent generations had their conceptual roots in the Johto period, where the idea that Pokémon could be appreciated for qualities beyond their combat utility began to emerge as a meaningful alternative framework. The specific aesthetic qualities of different Pokémon, their beauty or cleverness or coolness or cuteness, were qualities that the game's design had always communicated through visual means. But the contest system would eventually give these qualities mechanical expression. Johto was the generation in which the philosophical groundwork for this system was laid, even if its full implementation came later. The Safari Zone's particular design created a different kind of encounter experience from ordinary wild battles, replacing the standard mechanics of weakening and capturing with a system of patience and specific tools. The restriction of player action within the zone communicated something about the relationship between people and wildlife in protected natural areas, the idea that in certain spaces, human agency appropriately yielded to the terms of the creatures being observed. This design choice gave the Safari Zone a character that distinguished it from other catching locations in a way that went beyond simple mechanical variety. The fishing system across Johto's water routes created a specific practice of patient engagement with the water environment that yielded different creatures depending on the quality of the rod used and the depth of the water being fished. This system encoded a model of fishing knowledge, the understanding that different techniques accessed different ecological layers, into a simple mechanical framework that players absorbed as they experimented with different approaches. The creatures accessible only through Super Rod represented an ocean depth that other forms of encounter could not reach, a dimension of the aquatic environment that required specific tools and knowledge to access. Tentacruel, encountered in the open ocean routes between Johto's coastal cities, was one of the generation's more complex aquatic designs in terms of the depth of its Pokédex entries. Its numerous tentacles, described as capable of extending to significant lengths to snare prey, gave it a hunting strategy rooted in real jellyfish biology, while the crystalline orbs incorporated into its design suggested something more like a technological or mineral structure. The tension between the biological and the geological in Tentacruel's design was never resolved by the Pokédex, and that unresolved quality gave the creature an alien character, appropriate to the deep ocean environment it preferred. Mantine's surfing behavior was one of the generation's more evocative pieces of ecological description. The image of enormous rays leaping completely clear of the ocean's surface translated into a Pokémon encounter that felt genuinely wondrous. The Remoraid attached to Mantine's underside added a dimension of ecological relationship to what might otherwise have been a simple, large water-type design, suggesting that the creature existed within a web of mutual dependency rather than in isolation. The Remoraid used Mantine's feeding activity as a source of food while providing some form of benefit in return, a model of symbiotic relationship that was unusual in Pokemon's typically predator-prey framing of interspecies interaction. The concept of roots that changed character based on the time of day was realized in Johto in a way that made temporal awareness a genuine navigation skill. Routes that were straightforward in daylight became more complex at night when different trainers appeared and different wild Pokemon populated the grass. The emotional quality of familiar landscapes changed across the day-night cycle in ways that invited players to revisit places they thought they knew and find them transformed by the hour. A route encountered first at noon had a different character when crossed at midnight, and that difference was not just aesthetic, but mechanical and narrative, the world genuinely different depending on when you arrived in it. The music that accompanied night travel in Johto was one of the generation's most effective uses of sonic design to create emotional atmosphere. The familiar melodies of roots heard during daylight returned in slower, quieter arrangements at night. The same notes played with a quality of restraint that communicated the world conserving itself during the hours of darkness. This musical relationship between day and night versions of the same spaces suggested a world with genuine circadian rhythm, a place that breathed in and out across the full 24 hours, rather than existing in a perpetual presentness. The national park's bug catching contest operated on a specific schedule tied to the in-game day of the week, and players who wanted to participate had to return on the appropriate day. This scheduling created a relationship between the player and the game's calendar that extended the experience beyond any single session, building a pattern of return and engagement that echoed the way real seasonal activities create recurring relationships with the natural world. The prizes offered by the contest rewarded players who brought back the most impressive specimens, creating a gentle competitive structure around the act of observation and capture that gave the park visits a purpose beyond simple resource collection. The evolution of competitive Pokemon battling strategy across the Johto period introduced new dimensions of complexity to a system that had already been sophisticated in its first iteration. The addition of held items created a new layer of preparation and decision-making, with different items enabling different strategies, and the interaction between items and abilities creating emergent tactical possibilities that the game's designers could not have fully anticipated. The competitive community that developed around Gold and Silver's mechanics was one of the earliest examples of a game's player community developing strategic depth that exceeded its designer's original vision. The learn set of moves available to different Pokemon in Johto reflected a design philosophy that valued thematic consistency between a creature's visual identity and its battle behavior. A Pokemon designed around fire should generally have access to a range of fire-type moves that reflected different aspects of fire's behavior, and the best designs in Johto managed this consistency while also providing enough flexibility to support multiple viable battle strategies. The creatures that felt most fully realized as both visual designs and battle participants were those where the mechanics and the aesthetics supported each other in a way that felt motivated rather than arbitrary. The concept of type immunities and how they interacted with specific move mechanics was one of the more technically interesting aspects of Johto's battle system. Ghost-type Pokemon's immunity to normal and fighting moves, which reflected the folklore logic of ghosts as insubstantial and unaffected by physical force, created specific tactical situations that rewarded players who understood the type chart's exceptions as well as its standard relationships. Normal-type Pokemon's immunity to Ghost moves created a matching immunity on the other side of this relationship, a mutual exclusion between normal and Ghost that encoded a specific folkloric logic within the mechanical system. The introduction of Dark and Steel types in the Johto generation added layers to the type interaction system that changed the strategic landscape significantly. Dark type moves specifically affected psychic type Pokemon in a way that suggested a design intention to balance what had been an overpowered type in the previous generation. But the thematic logic of darkness affecting psychic power also made intuitive sense within the broader world. Steel's resistance to poison and its immunity to poison damage gave it a specific defensive profile that reflected the logic of metal's imperviousness to certain forms of organic attack, a mechanical expression of material properties translated into game terms. The Pokemon World Tournament concepts that would be developed in subsequent games had their earliest expressions in the tournament structures accessible in Johto, where the concept of battles organized into formal competition with specific rules and prize structures gave the game a dimension of organized play that extended beyond the main story. These organized competitive structures communicated that the world of Pokemon battles was not just a series of individual encounters, but a cultural practice with its own institutions, traditions, and community. The relationship between New Barktown and the concept of fresh beginning was embedded not just in the settlement's name, but in the specific design choices made for its presentation. The wind that blew through New Bark was mentioned in the game's opening text as a defining characteristic of the place, and the image of wind as both a physical reality and a metaphor for the forward motion of beginning was consistent with the generation's broader interest in natural phenomena as meaning-making systems. The starter Pokemon chose, and the first route walked out of New Bark together, marked a specific threshold, the passage from one state to another that every journey required, and the game's design honored that threshold with the solemnity it deserved. Route 29's gentle introduction to the game mechanics of wild encounters and trainer battles was calibrated with unusual care for the learning experience it was designed to provide. The Pokemon encountered in the tall grass were weak enough to be safely experimented with, and the trainers encountered were straightforward enough to be defeated without the advanced strategic thinking that later routes would require. This calibration of difficulty to developmental stage was one of Johto's quieter pedagogical achievements, teaching through carefully structured encounter rather than explicit instruction. The concept of the Pokemon world as a place with ongoing history, where events had occurred before the player's arrival and would continue after their departure, was reinforced in Johto by the physical evidence of past events visible in the landscape. The burned tower in Ecruteak was not a game mechanic, but a historical fact, a building that had stood and burned and been left as a ruin because that was what actually happened. The three Pokemon who died and were reborn, they were not created for the player's benefit, but had been living that existence for years before the game began. The player arrived in a world that was already in progress, and that sense of entering an ongoing story rather than initiating one gave Johto a temporal depth that most games do not attempt. The radio broadcasts that could be received on the Pokégear throughout the journey provided a constant ambient layer of world-building information that players could engage with or ignore according to their interest. Professor Oak's Pokémon Talk, the Buena's Password segment, the music broadcasts that could calm wild Pokémon or increase encounter rates, all of these contributed to a sense of the world as genuinely mediated, a place where information and entertainment moved through broadcast systems that served everyone in the region simultaneously. The radio was a shared public resource, and its presence in the player's pocket gave the private experience of the journey a connection to the broader community of the region. The concept of time zones and the experience of different players being in different moments of the same day was not directly represented in Johto's design, but was obliquely referenced by the decision to tie game events to the player's actual clock. Players in different time zones setting up their Pokégear clocks differently would experience certain events at genuinely different times, creating a subtle synchronization between the game world's day and the real world's day that was both mechanically simple and philosophically rich. The game world's time was the player's time, and that identification created a specific form of presence in the experience. The legendary Beast Pursuit across Johto's routes was one of the generation's most successful experiments in using game mechanics to generate emotional experience. The beasts roamed the region randomly, appearing on any route and fleeing immediately upon encounter, and the act of tracking them through the Pokédex's location data required patience and a specific kind of hopeful alertness. Every route might contain the encounter that had been building over hours of play, and that possibility changed the quality of attention brought to ordinary travel. Players who finally completed the capture of all three beasts had not just collected three creatures, but had participated in a specific experience of patient pursuit that the game's design had orchestrated carefully. The time capsule mechanic that allowed trading between gold and silver in the original red, blue, and yellow games was a design choice that honored the continuity between generations without pretending that the old and new were identical. The specific restrictions on which Pokemon could travel back in time, only those known in the original generation without moves introduced in the new generation, preserved a degree of internal consistency while still allowing the connection to be made. The capsule was not presented as a miracle of convenience, but as a technology with limitations that reflected the constraints of bridging two different systems, and those limitations made the connection feel earned rather than simply provided. The small story visible in the evolution of Marill's design across media illustrated how Pokemon characters took on lives beyond the games that had originally defined them. Marill's appearance in the anime and in promotional materials before the game's official release had made it the most anticipated design of the pre-release period, and the creature that appeared in the actual games was precisely what the promotional material had suggested. This consistency between marketing and product was not universal in the industry, and the trust it built with the Pokemon community contributed to the generation's reception as something that delivered on what it had promised. The experience of encountering Pokemon not available in one version of the game, but accessible through trading with players who had the other version, created a social infrastructure around collection that extended the game's meaning into the relationships between players. The version exclusives in gold and silver were carefully chosen to give each version its own distinct character while ensuring that neither was definitively superior. Vulpix in silver and Growlithe in gold, Phanpy in gold and Teddiursa in silver, Gligar in gold and Mantine in silver, all of these pairings were structured to require cooperation for completeness rather than competition between versions. The Pokemon Pinball spin-off that was developed around the same period brought the gold and silver Pokemon into a different mechanical context, and the way those designs translated into the visual language of pinball illustrated how strong the creature designs were as graphic forms. Pokemon that read clearly as silhouettes in the game's small sprite format maintained their identity across very different presentations, a quality of visual robustness that reflected the strength of the original design work. The manga adaptations of Gold and Silver that ran concurrently with the game's releases provided an alternative interpretation of the Johto story that emphasized different aspects of the world's character. The manga's version of Gold, Silver, and Crystal was more dramatically intense than the game's relatively gentle narrative, and the legendary encounters were rendered with a scale and consequence that the game's format could not match. These parallel stories enrich the sense of Johto as a world with multiple possible interpretations, a place that could support different kinds of stories without being exhausted by any single telling. The trading card game sets associated with the Gold and Silver generation brought the designs of Johto's Pokemon into a physical format that many players encountered before or alongside the video games. The card art commissioned for these sets often captured qualities of the designs that the game's sprites could not fully express, giving artists the opportunity to render Typhlosion's blazing mane or Suicune's streaming ribbons with a freedom unavailable in pixelated form. Some of these card artworks became iconic representations of their subjects, images that defined how players visualized creatures they had primarily known through small sprite animations. The anime series that accompanied the game's release traced a parallel version of the Johto journey that shared the geography and many of the characters while developing its own distinct narrative priorities. Ash's Johto journey was longer and more episodic than his Kanto adventure had been, and the extended time spent in the region allowed the anime to explore Johto's world in greater depth than had been possible in the first series. The Pokemon encountered throughout this journey were rendered in the anime's particular visual style, which softened the more angular elements of the game designs into something more consistently round and expressive. The friendship that developed between Ash and Pikachu across the Johto anime episodes continued to be the emotional center of the series, and the experiences accumulated during the Johto journey added new dimensions to a relationship already defined by loyalty and mutual understanding. The moments when Pikachu's individual personality emerged most clearly, its stubbornness, its occasional mischief, its fierce attachment to Ash during moments of genuine danger, were the moments when the anime most fully realized what the Pokemon franchise had always been fundamentally about: the specific bond between one person and one creature that could not be reduced to any general principle. The concept of the gym badge as a physical representation of achievement and mastery was one of the franchise's most enduring visual symbols, and the specific designs of Johto's 8 badges communicated something about each gym leader's individual character and type specialty. The Zephyr badge's simple wing shape, the Hive badge's honeycomb geometry, the Plane badge's circular simplicity, the Fog badge's cloud-like form, the Storm badge's angular electricity, the Mineral badge's crystal facets, the Glacier badge's frozen points, the Rising badge's draconic sweep. All of these were small graphic designs that worked simultaneously as game tokens, as souvenirs of encounters, and as visual representations of the knowledge and skill those encounters had required. The Pokemon Stadium games that allowed Gold and Silver Pokemon to be transferred to larger screen, three-dimensional presentations showed how the designs that had been developed for small sprite format translated into rendered three-dimensional forms. The Stadium presentations emphasized qualities of the designs that sprites could only suggest: the sheer scale of Steelix's segmented body, the fluid grace of Suicune's movement, the weight and power of Tyranitar's stride. These three-dimensional interpretations were not replacements for the game's original presentation, but expansions, additional ways of knowing creatures that players had learned to care about in a different visual register. The concept of legendary Pokemon as beings whose power operated at geological or meteorological scales was one of Johto's most ambitious design contributions to the franchise. Ho-Oh's rainbow-producing flight and Lugia's storm-generating wings both described creatures whose physical processes interacted with the large-scale systems of the natural world, weather, and light and ocean conditions in ways that made them participants in the environment rather than simply inhabitants of it. This ecological framing of legendary power gave the creatures a scientific dimension alongside their mythological one, connecting them to the natural world's actual operating systems rather than simply asserting their power through narrative declaration. The Crystal version of the Johto games, released after Gold and Silver, added layers to the experience that demonstrated how the same world could be further developed without requiring the player to start from nothing. The animated sprites that Crystal introduced gave each creature a movement that the static sprites of Gold and Silver could not provide, and these small animations captured qualities of character and behavior that supplemented the Pokédex entries without replacing them. A Cyndaquil that shook itself to stoke its back flames, a Marill that swayed with the contained energy of a creature comfortable in its own skin, and Ampharos that raised its illuminated crest with quiet dignity. All of these brief animations added dimensions of life to designs that had already communicated effectively in still form. The Crystal version also introduced a playable female protagonist for the first time in the main series, a design decision that expanded the imaginative space the games occupied for a significant portion of their audience. The option to play as Chris, the female trainer, was not presented with fanfare but simply offered as an alternative alongside the male option, and the normality of this inclusion communicated something about the values the games held regarding who their stories were for. The journey through Johto was not a gendered experience, but a human one, and the design team's acknowledgement of this through the option of a female lead was consistent with the generation's broader interest in questions of identity and belonging. The specific qualities of each Pokémon type, as they had developed across 2 generations of games, created a taxonomy of the natural world that operated according to its own consistent logic. Flying type Pokémon were generally associated with freedom and elevation, but within that broad category, the difference between Pidgeot's proud mastery of the air and Noctowl's nocturnal silent hunting and Togetic's guardian angel associations created a range of flying type personalities that prevented the type from feeling monolithic. The same richness applied to every type, each one a category that contained contradictions and variations that rewarded exploration. The sound design throughout Johto, beyond just the music, included the cry sounds that each Pokémon produced in battle and in certain overworld encounters, and these cries functioned as acoustic identifiers that players learned to associate with specific creatures even before seeing their sprites. The distinctive cry of a Marill, the resonant call of a Stantler, the unsettling sound associated with Misdreavus's approach, all of these contributed to a sonic vocabulary of creature identity that supplemented the visual one. Players who had spent significant time with the games could recognize many Pokémon by sound alone, a depth of familiarity that spoke to the consistency and care with which these acoustic signatures had been designed. The world of Johto had edges that implied a larger world beyond them, places that could not be fully explored within the bounds of the game, but whose presence suggested that the region existed within a continent and a planet of considerable extent. The routes leading to and from Kanto were the most explicit of these edges, but the ocean visible beyond the Whirl Islands and the mountains that defined the region's northern boundary also communicated a world that extended past what the player could access. This quality of implied vastness gave the region a geographic character appropriate to a place that felt genuinely located in a larger world rather than floating in isolation. The post-game content available after defeating the Elite Four and Champion represented Johto's most generous gift to players who had invested deeply in the experience. The journey to Kanto was not a separate game, but a continuation of the same one, using the same systems and the same party of Pokémon in a new environment that rewarded familiarity with what had come before. Players who had grown up with the Kanto region found Johto's access to it emotionally resonant in ways that went beyond simple nostalgia, because the return was not to an unchanged place, but to one that time had touched, where the familiar and the different coexisted in ways that reflected the player's own experience of returning to something previously known. The gym leaders of Kanto encountered in their rematches were significantly more powerful than their original incarnations, with teams that reflected their continued development as trainers over the years since the first game's events. This progression communicated that the trainers of the Pokémon world grew and changed over time, that the fixed points of encounter in the original games had been a single moment in ongoing lives that extended before and after the player's arrival. The world did not stop and wait for the player, but continued developing alongside them, and the return to Kanto made that development visible in specific personal terms. The final summit encounter with Red in the Indigo Plateau's heights was among the most acclaimed moments in the game's design. A confrontation that arrived without announcement at the end of a challenging climb, and that placed the player opposite a silent, wordless opponent whose team communicated everything necessary about his character and his history. Red carried the strongest version of the original game's starter Pokémon, evidence of a journey completed and a mastery achieved through years of dedicated training after the events the player might have played through themselves. The silence of the encounter, the complete absence of dialogue in a game that had been full of conversation, was one of the generation's most effective uses of restraint, communicating more through what was withheld than anything explicit statement could have achieved. The Pokemon world's approach to the concept of evolution differed fundamentally from the biological theory it borrowed its name from, and this difference was one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the game's design. In real evolutionary theory, change occurs across generations through differential reproduction, a process measured in geological time and driven by environmental pressure. In the Pokemon world, evolution happened to individual creatures within single lifetimes, sometimes triggered by specific environmental conditions or experiences, but always resulting in a transformation of the individual rather than a gradual change in the population. This redefinition of evolution as personal transformation rather than population change gave the concept a narrative weight that the biological original lacked, connecting the mechanics of creature development to the broader human themes of growth and change that the games explored across all their other systems. The question of what a Pokemon experienced during evolution was one that the games deliberately left unanswered. The transformation was instantaneous in mechanical terms, a flash of light followed by a new form, but whether the creature experienced this transition as continuous with its previous existence or as something more disruptive was never clarified by any official source. This ambiguity was consistent with the game's broader approach to questions about Pokemon consciousness and experience, which were acknowledged as meaningful questions without being definitively answered. The world of Pokemon was comfortable living with uncertainty about the inner lives of its creatures, and this comfort was one of the things that gave the series a philosophical sophistication unusual in games primarily marketed to young audiences. The concept of the Pokemon storage system, where creatures not currently in the active party were held in a digital space maintained by the in-game computer network, raised questions about the experience of stored Pokemon that the games approached with occasional humor and occasional genuine seriousness. A stored Pokemon was not present with the player, but presumably existed somewhere, in some state, accessible but not accessed. The precise nature of this state was another of the game's deliberate ambiguities, one that players could choose to ignore or to think about seriously depending on their interest in the world's internal logic. Bill's system of Pokemon storage was one of the original game's most charming pieces of in-world science fiction. A character who had built the technology while accidentally transforming himself into a Pokemon in the process, and who had subsequently devoted his professional life to improving what he had created. His move to Goldenrod City in Johto, where he continued his research while making occasional appearances that provided players with useful items, suggested a life ongoing beyond the player's specific encounters with him, a researcher with a history and a future that extended past the edges of the game's frame. The specific design of the Pokemon professor as a figure of scientific authority who provided the player with their starter Pokemon and their initial Pokedex was a franchise tradition that Johto honored while giving it a specifically Johto character. Professor Elm was distinguished from his predecessor Oak by his more anxious, distracted quality, a scientist so absorbed in his research that the practical demands of everyday life sometimes caught him off guard. This characterization made Elm feel like a genuine scientist rather than simply a narrative function, a person whose internal life was organized around questions that had nothing to do with the player's journey and everything to do with his own intellectual curiosity. The rival character in Johto, who stole one of the starter Pokémon from Professor Elm's laboratory and encountered the player repeatedly throughout the journey, was one of the generation's more morally complex character designs. Unlike previous rival characters, who were simply competitive, this character was explicitly antagonistic and ethically questionable, his theft a genuine wrong rather than a playful challenge. The gradual revelation of his motivation, rooted in his relationship with his grandfather Giovanni, the former leader of Team Rocket, gave his antagonism a context that explained without entirely excusing it. Players who engaged with this narrative found a story about the weight of family history and the struggle to define oneself against a legacy of harm that was unusually sophisticated for the medium. The transformation of the rival character across the game's story, from a hostile presence who treated his Pokémon as tools to a more conflicted figure who had begun to recognize the cost of that approach, was handled with restraint rather than dramatic revelation. The moments of doubt visible in certain late-game encounters suggested a character in the process of reconsidering something fundamental without having fully completed that reconsideration. The game did not resolve this arc definitively, leaving players with a sense of a person in transition whose ultimate direction was uncertain, a narrative choice that respected the complexity of genuine character change. Team Rocket's operations in Johto were distinguished from their previous generation's activities by a sense of institutional decline, the organization attempting to contact its missing leader through radio tower broadcasts while pursuing smaller, more opportunistic crimes. The Slowpoke Tail operation in Azalea Town and the Mahogany Town hideout were not grand schemes, but practical business, an organization maintaining operations while waiting for leadership that might not return. This portrayal of Team Rocket as a criminal enterprise dealing with genuine institutional problems gave the antagonists a mundane credibility that made them more threatening in certain ways than a more fantastical villain organization would have been. The three executives encountered in Johto's late-game Team Rocket operations, Archer, Ariana, and Proton, each had distinct personalities that communicated different aspects of what it meant to remain loyal to an absent leader. Archer's zealous insistence that Giovanni would return contrasted with the more pragmatic approaches of the others, and the variety of motivations represented within the organization suggested a criminal enterprise composed of actual people rather than simply a monolithic obstacle. The radio tower takeover that served as the generation's climactic Team Rocket sequence was staged with genuine dramatic tension, the broadcast disrupted and replaced with the desperate appeals of an organization that no longer knew whether anyone was listening. The encounter with the Rocket executives leading up to the radio tower's liberation required the player to navigate not just tactical battle challenges, but the emotional character of each opponent. Fighting an antagonist whose motivation was genuine loyalty to an absent figure they respected was a different experience from fighting one motivated simply by greed or power, and Johto's design recognized this difference in how it framed the encounters and their outcomes. The defeat of the Team Rocket operation in Johto was not simply the removal of an obstacle, but the conclusion of a story about organizational decline and the people left behind when leadership fails. The Safari Zone's unique population created opportunities for players to encounter Pokémon that were not available in the wild anywhere else in the region, and the specific creatures found there were chosen with attention to their ecological appropriateness for a protected natural area. Tauros, Rhyhorn, and other large, powerful creatures that would have been too dangerous for ordinary wild routes were manageable within the Safari Zone's specific rules, where the player's tools were limited and direct confrontation was replaced by a more careful form of engagement. The zone was a space governed by different rules because the creatures within it required different treatment, and that design logic was consistent with the real principles of wildlife conservation areas. The relationship between the game's clock system and the real world extended beyond the simple day night cycle to include the day of the week as a meaningful variable. Certain events and certain trainers and certain in game activities were available only on specific days, creating a game that rewarded consistent engagement over time rather than marathon sessions focused on completion. The breeding center couple encountered on Route 34 would comment differently on the Pokémon left with them depending on the day, and these small variations accumulated into a sense of the game world as genuinely time sensitive, a place that moved whether or not the player was present. The berries found growing on trees in specific locations throughout Johto required players to return periodically if they wanted a reliable supply, since the trees would regrow their berries over time after being harvested. This renewal mechanic connected the berry trees to the real logic of fruit-bearing plants, which produce repeatedly rather than once, and it created a pattern of return and harvest that extended the game's engagement over a longer period than a single pass completion would have required. The specific berries available at different trees were consistent across the game's internal seasons, and players who paid attention to which trees grew, which berries developed a geographic knowledge of the region's agricultural resources that supplemented their knowledge of its Pokémon ecology. The connections between Johto's human characters and the broader network of Pokémon trainers visible across the region created a social world that extended beyond the player's immediate encounters. The trainer phone numbers recorded in the Pokégear over the course of the journey represented not just potential rematch opponents, but a community of people with shared interests and different levels of experience. The calls received from these trainers ranged from requests for rematches to observations about Pokémon sightings to simple social contact, and the variety of motivations represented in these calls gave the network of Johto's trainers a human texture that made the region feel genuinely inhabited. The Kimono Girls, encountered at multiple points throughout the Johto journey and associated with the legendary Pokemon's narrative in the game's climactic moments, were one of the generation's most deliberately mysterious character groups. Their traditional dress and formal manner connected them to Johto's aesthetic of cultural preservation, and their knowledge of the region's mythological history placed them in a role of custodianship that was never fully explained. The player's interactions with them across the game traced a relationship that developed through repeated encounter and implicit trust rather than explicit alliance, and the final collaboration in the Bell Tower or Whirl Islands felt like the culmination of something that had been building throughout the journey. The concept of a Pokemon's individual values, the hidden numerical qualities that made each specimen of a given species slightly different from all others of its kind, had been present in the games from the beginning, but became more widely understood and discussed in the Johto period as the competitive community developed more sophisticated methods of analysis. The understanding that two Machamp of the same level and experience could have genuinely different battle performance due to individual qualities not visible in their displayed statistics added a dimension of particularity to Pokemon that contradicted any simple reading of them as interchangeable by species. Each creature was individual in ways that were not entirely visible to the casual observer, but that had real consequences for those who paid attention. The connection between the Johto games and the earlier titles through the link cable trading system created one of the more unusual temporal puzzles in video game history. Players could trade Pokemon from the original Red, Blue, and Yellow games into Gold and Silver, but not in the reverse direction. And certain Pokemon carried over in this way would arrive with movesets that could not be legitimately obtained within the new generation. These imported creatures existed in a specific relationship with the game world's internal continuity, carrying evidence of histories that the new game's own systems could not have produced. The time capsule that mediated these trades was one of the most honest pieces of game design in the franchise, acknowledging the asymmetry of temporal movement across two different systems rather than pretending it did not exist. The specific experience of playing Gold and Silver on the original Game Boy Color hardware, with its small screen and the warm quality of light visible through the device's own display, created an aesthetic environment that the game's designs were created to function within. The colors chosen for Pokemon sprites and environment tiles were calibrated for the Game Boy Color's specific display characteristics, and the result was a visual experience that had a warmth and intimacy appropriate to the scale of the device. The games could be played in the palm of a hand, and this scale of the playing experience connected to the game's investment in small details and quiet moments in a way that felt consistent. The music of the Route 29 theme, heard in the first moments of leaving New Barktown and beginning the journey, was composed with the specific qualities of the Game Boy Color's sound chip in mind, and the result was a piece of music that operated within significant technical constraints but used those constraints creatively to achieve an emotional effect that more powerful hardware would not necessarily have improved. The limitations of the hardware shaped the aesthetic of the music in ways that gave it a specific character, and that character became inseparable from the emotional associations players formed with the Johto journey. The technical achievement of fitting the entire dual region experience of Johto and Kanto, along with all their creatures and locations and mechanics, into the storage available on a Game Boy Color cartridge was one of the more remarkable engineering accomplishments in game development history. The compression required to make this possible involved technical solutions that pushed against the limits of what the hardware could reasonably be asked to do, and the result was occasionally visible in places where the game's performance showed the cost of that compression. But the decision to include both regions, rather than restricting the game to Johto alone, was one that defined the experience in a way no technical limitation could have justified removing. The lasting influence of the Johto generation on the Pokémon franchise's subsequent development was visible in the recurring elements that appeared in later games in forms that traced back to innovations first made in Gold and Silver. The daycare breeding system, the held item mechanics, the day and night cycle, the phone contacts, the National Park bug catching contest. All of these were features that later generations built upon and expanded, and their presence in subsequent games was an implicit acknowledgement of what Johto had established as possibilities worth developing further. The decision to set the third version of the Johto games, Pokémon Crystal, specifically around the narrative of Suicune, created the first instance of a legendary Pokémon serving as the central focus of a third version story, rather than simply being an additional encounter. The character of Unown, a researcher devoted to studying and understanding Suicune, provided a human perspective on the relationship between people and legendary Pokémon that added emotional depth to encounters that might otherwise have been purely mechanical. His frustrated admiration for a creature that always remained just beyond his reach communicated something genuine about the experience of trying to understand wild things on their own terms rather than simply capturing them. Crystal's animated battle sprites were among the most significant quality of life improvements in the generation's development, and their introduction established an expectation for creature animation in battle that the series maintained and expanded in every subsequent entry. The specific animations chosen for each Pokémon reflected something about each creature's character, and the decisions about how to move a Wooper differently from a Scizor or a Marill differently from a Tyranitar required a specific form of character knowledge that translated the static design work of the sprite artists into temporal expression. The Pokémon Snap game, released around the same period, offered a completely different mode of engagement with many of Johto's and Kanto's creatures, one based entirely on observation and photography rather than battle and capture. The creatures in Pokémon Snap had behaviors and environmental relationships that the main games could only hint at, and the experience of patiently positioning for a good shot of a creature going about its natural activities created a specific quality of attention that enriched the understanding players brought to those same creatures in other contexts. The photograph album that accumulated across a Pokemon Snap playthrough was a record of encounters understood through the logic of wildlife photography rather than capture and collection, and the different understanding that logic produced was one of the broader franchise's most interesting experiments in perspective. The relationship between the games and their players across the years since Johto's original release has been one of the franchise's most enduring features, with players returning to the region periodically throughout their lives and finding in it something that scales with their capacity for appreciation. Children who played Gold and Silver found adventures and creatures in a world to explore. Teenagers who returned to it found the narrative complexity and cultural depth they had not had the context to recognize before. Adults who came back found a meditation on tradition and change and the relationship between the world as it is and as it has been that resonated with experiences the original players could not have had when they first played through it. The scalability of meaning, the capacity of the same work to offer different things to different kinds of attention and different stages of life was not accidental, but the result of design work that had embedded multiple layers of meaning into every element without requiring any single layer to be visible to all players simultaneously. The games were genuinely accessible to young players while being genuinely rewarding for thoughtful older ones, and that double accommodation was one of the rarest and most valuable achievements in all of entertainment design. What Johto offered and continues to offer to anyone who comes to it, willing to receive what it has, was the experience of a world that cared about itself, that had been imagined with love and populated with creatures whose designs told stories, and set in locations whose histories had weight and governed by a day and night cycle that matched the real world's rhythms. To play through Johto slowly, without rushing toward completion, was to participate in an experience of a world at its most fully realized, and the memory of that participation persisted long after the specific mechanics had been forgotten, as all genuinely meaningful experiences do, in the quality of attention it had taught and the sense of possibility it had opened. The mysteries of Johto were never hidden from those willing to look. They were present in every Pokédex entry that rewarded a careful reader, in every design that revealed its sources to those curious enough to investigate them, in every location whose history was available to any player who stopped to read the signs and speak to the characters who had been placed there specifically to share what they knew. The world had been built to be known, and the knowing of it was its own reward, sufficient and complete and available to everyone who arrived at it, with the willingness to be present for what it offered. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.